student-led event, which will happen in April. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Tiana. It's a great way to start. And as Michael said, my name is Steve Wise. I'm Executive Director of the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy, and I'll be your host today. A song, yeah, well, thank you. I'm going to get to that too. I'm a song keeper, and I promise to bring music to most of the things that I didn't bring the guitar for introductions today. I didn't have but there will be a song theme too. And just to add what Michael said, we're here to talk about connectivity, which is a great overarching concept, and I think there's a number of ways we interpret it, looking at the landscape, looking at the wildlife, but also looking at culture. And the other thing that we've got in this room, if you look around you, the people next to you are part of different coalitions. We have, I'm not sure how many different coalitions in the room, but that coalition is what we're building on here and what gives us the ability to accomplish things and actually enact the vision of connectivity that this group and others have been working on for years and years and years and years. We have indigenous-led organizations and tribal leaders. We have nonprofit organizations, the defenders of fish, of wildlife, of forests, of rivers, of the land, and its communities. And we have public servants from the public agencies who are an essential part of this process and who are here to work with us and make things happen. And this is, what happens when we come together is that we have the ability to create action, positive progress, and as Michael said, it's miraculous to see what has happened in the short period since the last time this group got together in this room to think about how we could act together for the betterment of connectivity and the region's health. We have, as he said, 4 dams off the Klamath. We have a highway crossing that was only a dreamscape. I thought it was impossible. And we have these increasing coalitions in the presence of new land trust in our community working to bring energy together to make things happen. The song theme I was thinking about is a Patti Smith song, punk rock. People have the power. People have the power to dream, to rule, to wrestle the world from fools, right? This is what we're here to do, and if we have to wrestle the world from fools, that's fine. We're the people to do it. We do it together. We do it with strength. We do it with joy and beauty. So all of these things will be what you'll hear more about today. I am honored and proud to be part of this group and to hear from all of the collected wisdom. We have decades of working experience and centuries of cultural wisdom and ecological knowledge that we are sharing that you'll be hearing about today. This is how we get connectivity done, but enough from me. So Paul, my colleague, reminded me to bring my glasses so that I could actually follow the notes. And I'll start by introducing our next speaker, who is talking about biodiversity and connectivity. Charlie Schultz is among those public servants who we honor for their dedication and the work that they've done. For the past 38 years, he's worked with a number of agencies, including being the ecologist for the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. And his notes say he's interested in everything, which is just perfect. I mean, what else can we think about? So without further ado, Charlie Schultz, come on up and tell us what we need to know about biodiversity and connectivity in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, the Cascade-Siskiyou Crest. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone, and it's good to see you all here. What a great crowd so far. Okay, and I've already been introduced, so I'm going to skip that part of my talk. I'd like to start my talks with a couple of attention-getting slides. This is my big bang, so this one here, let's see if this works. Oops. This is my Big Bang theory slide, as demonstrated by an ornamental onion in my backyard here in Ashland. A reminder of where it all came from, where we all came from. It is just an onion, but it is so much more. That's the beauty of it, the apparent simplicity of symmetry and the complexity of expanding connections. That's evolution. Here's a little about my own evolution. I started out as a civil engineer, realized it was just replacing nature with stuff. Got tired of that, went back to school and started biology and botany. Started to study biology and botany. Friends said you can't get a job doing that. I said in my youthful exuberance, I don't want a job, I want a life. Eventually I started with the Forest Service as a botanist, then noticed how plants impact wildlife and habitat. I included wildlife and became a general biologist. Then got into geology and soils and hydrology and water quality and how it's all connected, and eventually became an ecologist, all because it's all connected. That's the theme here today. Okay. Then let's add a little sick humor, because there's very little difference between laughing and crying. And it's about what we do and how it always impacts others. It's all connected. And then a little philosophizing. Here we are, all together. Think about how you got here this morning. What corridors did you travel? What roads? How are they connected to and influence others? Other people, other fellow beings. Here we are, connected because of those roads. The theme of this talk is it's complicated, but it's all connected. After 40 years as an ecologist, that's my big lesson in life. And I like this one because, real estate, it's all location, location, location. But in ecology, it's connection, connection, connection. So another primary theme here is connectivity drives biodiversity. I'd like to share a recipe with you that may help us understand how important this location we're in is in regards to connectivity. Connectivity, the linchpin for creating biodiversity. When habitats are connected, biodiversity flourishes. The trick is how to reconnect and keep them connected. That's why we are here. This is the general location for this discussion. We call it the Cascade-Siskiyou Land Bridge. I'm going to present a quick overview on why it's such an important region. In terms of connectivity, this area is viewed as an important biological crossroads, which refers to a place where different biological pathways intersect, leading to significant species level mixing and changes. So basically, we're sitting in an ecological melting pot or a mixing zone, and it's a pretty unique one for Western North America. In my view, we have here the perfect recipe for high biodiversity because of the extensive opportunities for biological connection. I like to cook, so often I think in terms of recipes. A recipe is a set of ingredients that achieve a particular outcome. I have 5 main ingredients that I would like to share that are all connected, that makes this place so special, that mixed all together provide for its unique biodiversity. The first ingredient is the incredible mix of ecoregions. This is a place where a number of diverse ecosystems have opportunities to interact, either directly or indirectly. We are located right at the intersection of the Cascade and Siskiyou Mountains, with influences from the Klamath Mountains, the Sierra Nevada Mountains, the coastal ranges, and the Great Basin Desert. The arrows here should have arrowheads at each end and on the sides, because these processes always move all ways. As you can see here, this is also an area where a number of official ecosystems merge. The Cascade-Siskiyou area is a focal point that literally takes in species, mixes them up, radiates them out in all directions. It is the ecological beating heart of not bleeding heart, beating heart of the region. This creates an ecologically rich and jumbled landscape. It's all connected. The next important ingredient is complex geology. The region is roughly split into two very different parts, with much mixing in between. The north and eastern parts lie within some of Oregon's youngest rocks. The volcanic Cascade Range is about 2 to 25 million years old. On the other hand, the southern and western portions of the area contain the oldest rocks in Oregon, the Siskiyou Mountains, at about 425 million years old. This area is truly a mixing of young and old. Plus, the dynamic plate tectonics of the area and the mixing of igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary formations has resulted in a wide assortment of rock types and soils. It's all connected. The next ingredient is an agreeable climate. The historic climate in recent times has been generally mild, which is important for species reproduction and survival, and for migration and dispersal. In addition, the older Siskiyou Mountains escaped extensive glaciation during recent ice ages, providing a refuge for numerous taxa and long periods of favorable conditions for species to adapt and evolve. It's all connected. And of course, the next ingredient is connectivity, because it's connections within connections within connections. A vital factor here is the unusual east-west orientation of the Siskiyou Mountains and its role as a land bridge between two extensive north-south oriented mountain ranges. The species of the wet forests of the coastal ranges connecting with the Siskiyous, through the Siskiyous to the Cascade Range, and mixing at the crossroads. Very few, if any, other areas along the west coast functionally connect major coastal and inland mountain systems, especially, and this is important, by relatively undeveloped and intact natural habitats. Evan Frost, a local ecologist, did an analysis of over 22 scientific papers on connectivity. And Evan, if you're watching this, thank you for your brilliance. He identified 6 primary landscape level linkages in this region with outstanding connectivity values, and concluded that this area, the Cascade-Siskiyou Land Bridge, is the highest priority biological corridor in the Northwest. Unfortunately, we share this spot with the busy interstate highway I-5, which will be discussed later in this workshop. Evan referenced various studies. Here's an example of a study by the Nature Conservancy where we looked at the intensity of the human footprint. The green and yellow areas have the lowest intensity right here where we are. And another by McRae et al., where they examined the regional ecological flow potential. The yellow areas have highest flow potential, again, where we are. The fifth and last ingredient is the lay of the land. The area is bisected by a meandering, prominent high ridge that separates the Rogue River and the Klamath River watersheds. The rugged and steep terrain that radiates from this ridge faces many directions. This affects sun exposure, elevation, temperature, moisture availability, etc., resulting in numerous microclimates that provide biological microsites for a wide variety of species to thrive in a small area. Yes, it's all connected. So that's it. That's my recipe for high connectivity and abundant biodiversity. And this area has it all. We are lucky to be here, and especially lucky to have this opportunity to protect and enhance our biodiversity by reinforcing our connections. To close, I would like to share 6 recommendations from Evan's work for consideration during this workshop. It's important to identify the opportunities and challenges of connectivity-friendly management. We need to find ways to support research that focuses on identifying migration corridors for important wildlife and other species. We should constantly collect expert input on connectivity and use it to further define and prioritize important linkage zones. We have to identify the most effective ways to avoid and reduce the negative impacts of human barriers to wildlife and generally biological migration. We need to expand education awareness campaigns, highlighting the importance of collected ecosystems. And lastly, moving forward, all connectivity planning must recognize and address climate change. Thank you. Thank you.
A great start, reminding me that I didn't do the logistical announcements. If you're hungry, there's food. Charlie talked about cooking. If you're tempted, feed yourself, take care of yourself. The restrooms are out in the hallway, and there will be lunch later. So take care of yourselves while you're enjoying this discussion. Our next panel discussion, we're going to go off screen. We have no slides. We're going old school here. And I'm very excited about this because my organization is the first and the oldest land trust in Oregon. We were founded in 1978, and we're the geezers of the group. But since that time, on the Oregon side of things, I know it's an imaginary line, but there are now 30 different land trusts functioning in this state, and you're about to meet the 31st, as well as one of the first indigenous-led land trusts from the other side of the line, so-called California border, on the Klamath side of things. So as Charlie said, here in this room we have the young and the old. It's so great that Tiana's here. Youth leadership is she's probably the most important person here because the youth leaders are the ones that are going to carry all this on when the rest of us are done. But we also have this in terms of the land trust community. There are at least 4 land trusts in the room. If any of the California land trusts are here, welcome, besides Kilt. But that's again, it's a growing coalition and a collaborative system that can work together. So our next group is starting with Jerome Viles. As of last year, the Nunessa Land Trust was founded by Jerome and several other founding board members. But Jerome's background is what I would call as a culture keeper. He's worked in language revitalization for a long time and has a BA in linguistics and a master's in nonprofit management, which is a really interesting combination of skills. He's been working on archival language research with members of the family and community to bring language and archives back into daily use. And he's currently with the, excuse my pronunciation because I'm not a linguist, the Miyahamia Center as the National Breath of Life Archives development trainer, trying to work on native language revitalization. And then the Nunessa Land Trust is a Siletz-led organization. Jerome is an enrolled member of the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians, born and raised in Eugene. And then we also have the other newest native land trust from the Klamath Indigenous Land Trust on the California side, working among the Klamath tribes and with Frankie Myers as one of the board members. Frankie is known for his success in building bridges between diverse stakeholder groups. Wow, amazing. Somebody who builds bridges in this room. What a coincidence. But he was also the vice chair of the Yurok tribe, and in his 2 terms, he worked with tribal, state, and federal lawmakers, as well as nonprofit corporations, family farmers, ranchers, and conservation groups to resolve some of the most complex challenges in California, and helped in the decades-long campaign to remove 4 fish-killing dams on the Klamath River. So we've got the 2 newest and native-led land trusts, Frankie and Jerome. Come on up, and we love to hear what you're up to. Welcome. Standing up, sitting down. Keep the mic close.
Okay. I'll get comfortable here. Jala, Shidut Jerome Viles, Chemet Dene Nashli, Sakweche Dene Nashli Hichu, Shi Shretchan, Hiwandu, G Dun Sasta, G Shres. So I'm Jerome Viles. I'm a Chemet person and a Sixes person from, sorry, get out of the light. Maybe I will use a podium. Yeah, it is kind of what it felt like. So yeah, I'm Jerome Viles. I'm from mouth of the Rogue River, my family is, and from the Sixes River. So we're coastal people. I'm enrolled in the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. I live up in Eugene with my 5-year-old son and my partner and much of my family. Thanks for the good introduction, Steve. That covers a lot of my background. So I come to this not through conservation or ecology, but through language revitalization, specifically working in the archival space. So for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on my tribal languages, Chinnequawa and Nuweat, Southwest Oregon Dene, Athabascan. You'll hear a lot of different names for that one. In the academy, sometimes it felt siloed. Linguistics was. In life, it never felt that way. Language is so connected to our culture. That's what it's connected to other people. What do you do with language is you talk with other people. And that's really what we're trying to do with language revitalization, is bring our community together to speak the language together. Through that work, I was exposed to a lot of historical research on my people. So a lot of, I won't do that talk, but a lot of anthropologists and ethnographers came through Siletz and recorded a lot of place names, a lot of language. And I started learning a lot of stuff that isn't in common knowledge in the community anymore. Learning about those place names, learning about the places that I come from. So I've always said, oh, we're Joshua and we're Sixes. When I was young, that was an abstraction. And through this language work, I started coming back to those places and having profound experiences of coming to ancestral places, knowing names of these places, and finding the things that we needed, that we were looking for. Go to a village and find all these plants that we know our people used, and know that we took care of that place. And that was really profound for me. And, you know, it is really what started me towards this land trust work. I wanted to share that with other people in our community, and came together as a board for Nunnesaw Land Trust. We've all had that experience. So as Steve said, we're all Siletz tribal members at Nunnesaw Land Trust. And we come from Southwest Oregon. So 3 of us, well, we're all coastal. A lot of people at Siletz are from the Southwest Oregon coast. And then we also have Tacoma and Shasta people at Siletz. I wanted to talk briefly about the history of Southwest Oregon, because it's really important context for how we're trying to do our work. So we had a good land acknowledgement. Thank you for that. And I'm happy that Shasta people are here going to school in their homelands. So the Rogue River Indian Wars happened. Usually the story kind of ends there. We have removal of Shasta and Tacoma people to Grand Ronde and Siletz. We have removal of Southwest Oregon Dene people to the Coast Reservation, becomes Siletz. And then we jump forward to today as, you know, okay, now everyone's at Siletz, but that's not the entire story. Some people resisted removal. There's people who stayed here. The California, I was looking for a map. The California border split our communities. So for our coastal people, our traditional territory is Wilson Creek, California, up to just south of Bandon. People on the north side of the border got moved to the Coast Reservation. For people in the Rogue Valley and this area, the border cut Shasta people and moved some of them up to Siletz and Grand Ronde, and some stayed in California. some of the people on the Oregon side escaped and they went to California and they were able to remain in their homelands. Some people married settlers and were able to stay and raise their families. And those people maintain their identities today, and have been a important connection for me. Through this language, land, culture work, I am connecting with our historic community. So we've been removed from our homelands for, it's 2025, so 170 years now, which feels like a long time with our short lives, but feels less long when I think about, you know, the 10,000 or 20,000 years that our people were here. So for us, we have a vision of serving the Indian people of this Indian removal area of Southwest Oregon. That's people at Grand Ronde and Siletz. That's people who are unenrolled, working with Confederated Tribes of the Lower Rogue or Shasta Indian Nation, but trying to have an inclusive vision of our community that crosses these government and community boundaries that were really forced upon us when colonization happened, when genocide was attempted, and when we were removed from our homelands. And yeah, so in 2023, the four of us got together to start Nanaisa Land Trust. It had been kind of a idea brewing for a long time, I think, with different people. Our board does land stuff, culture, land. You know, we have a really accomplished basket weaver. We all go out and get plant foods. Some of us are good fishermen, others aren't. Some of us hunt, but we're all out on the land a lot, and we're trying to do that more with each other. So our people have been trying to maintain our connections to place, our connection to environment, to our foodways, and that's, you know, we're in a period of revitalization, not just language, not just culture, but all of those ways. And there's a hunger for it in the community. And so we wanted to add something to that. There's so much opportunity right now. So we're, you know, working in the land space. A couple of our board members are on the Indigenous Gardens Network. And we're hearing there's all these landowners who want to do land back. They don't know how to do it. There's tons of partner organizations that want to work with tribes. There's, you know, agencies that want to work with tribes. The reality is with small tribes is there's capacity issues. The tribes are doing everything they can, but they can't do it all. And they're bombarded with requests all the time. So we came together wanting to add capacity to that, to our tribal governments and our unrecognized tribes, so that we can try to move that work forward and just add some people power, add some dedication, and add some focus to this land-based work. So yeah, we started in 2023. It started with a conversation. I like this story. It was me and our fellow board member, Brandon Larrabee, met up at a huckleberry patch. We're both up picking and just started talking about, let's start a land trust. And that kind of started. I think it's that's how we're trying to do our work, is grassroots on the land with each other. And the ideas and the work will generate from that. So we incorporated in 2023, so we're obviously very new. We just got our 501c3 status in 2024. We're really trying to identify early on, our focus is safe places for our people to go and practice their life ways. We're envisioning that in many different ways. We're hoping to hold title to land, so land acquisitions. We're hoping to facilitate land transfer to tribes when that makes more sense. Working with the existing organizations to identify good places to go. And on that point, maybe I'll touch on, you know, that idea of safe place to go, I think is self-evident for me and maybe other Native people. It's maybe new. for other folks, it's hard for us to come back sometimes. You know, we have removal, there's a lot of wounds in our community from that removal. And rural areas aren't always friendly areas to Native people. I look how I do, which makes it easier for me. It can be harder if you're brown. It can be harder if you're a woman. And it can feel unsafe trying to go. And you want to connect to these places, but you don't know where is safe. You're doing it on your own. So one of the things we're trying to do is create support for each other. So we're trying to do that work to get out in front and say, these are safe places that we can go. You can go and dig roots and be in that vulnerable position and know that someone's not going to roll up on you, or you're not going to have weird things happening out in the woods. So that's, yeah, I just wanted to touch on that. We've been really blown away by the outpouring of support from conservation organizations, land trusts. Steve has been a big supporter. We really appreciate you. We've gotten some early funding from the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. They've given us a lot of technical support, and then the Land Justice Project also has given us some support. We got funding this year from our Memorial Trust we're really excited about, and some smaller stuff from Land Trust Alliance and Keepers of the Earth. Maybe I'll end with talking about that Keepers of the Earth grant. That's our most concrete project to date. So we're working on some land transfer stuff. But we got funding from Keepers of the Earth, I think it's Cultural Survival Fund, to encourage traditional fishing in the Siletz community. So we're able to build a structure at one of the very few sites we're able to still dip net fish. So part of our history at Siletz is removal and then termination in the 1950s and then restoration. And we ended up losing almost all of our hunting and fishing rights, which is thankfully now we're getting them back. But we're very limited in practicing traditional dip net fishing. And we have 3 cultural sites, or I think we're getting 4 this year on the Siletz River. But our fishing season is November, December. It's wet and cold, obviously. It's coastal Oregon. That's up by Newport is a Siletz reservation. So we put together a project to build we call it the fish house. And it's basically a shed with a wood stove in it to encourage elders and children to get out to our traditional site to be able to dip net. And we stocked that up with nets, and we started seeing families coming out to try to dip net fish. It'd been on the decline for a long time, but we're really trying to get people out there practicing our life ways, connecting with lands down here, but also recognizing the reality of removal. We also have our people spread out all over. So trying to support our people where we are to get out and practice our ways and come together, to have some intergenerational knowledge transfer. And yeah, so that's us. That's Nunde-Saw Land Trust. Hopefully we have a lot more to report back in the coming years. And I think for this talk, I'm going to let Frankie go, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions too, I think. So that's it for me, though.
The Klamath Indigenous Land Trust was formed because 2 reasons. 1, necessity, and 2, frustration. The necessity for the Klamath Indigenous Land Trust was because for the last 20 years we had worked on removing the 4 lower dams on the Klamath River and reconnecting our watershed and our river. But dam removal was never the goal. The goal is where we're at now, post-dam removal, restoration period. And as we all know, restoration can be very, very dependent on land ownership. And what you do and the extent of your restoration often depends on landowners agreeing with what you want to do, whether the landowners are the federal government or the states or individuals or NGOs. Knowing how critical and how fast we would need to immediately begin restoration post-dam removal really started the conversation early on about where these lands were that we were already highlighted and already understood where critical habitat needed to be restored immediately, who owned those, and how can we own them? And so we started looking and thinking, and the group of folks who started the Klamath Indigenous Land Trust were also the same group of folks who 20 years ago started thinking about dam removal and building the dam removal campaign. So we had all worked together for a very, very long time and all understood the goal that we were all heading to, and felt like the best way for us to do that is to create a land trust, a place and a warehouse for land to be held while it is being restored, but also provide an opportunity. As Jerome said, most tribes struggle with capacity, regardless of how big the tribe is, regardless of how much revenue they generate. The capacity and the work that tribes are needing to do always exceeds their capacity to do it. Specifically when it comes to land management and land acquisition, there is always a continuing conversation about the capacity tribes have to reacquire their land. We felt that if we could create a warehouse, a place for land to be held temporarily until either A tribe was ready to reacquire the land, or built the capacity to do it themselves. So that was the necessity out of KILT. One, post-dam removal, and two, seeing a need for tribes to get some additional help to reacquire their land. The second reason was frustration. Frustration with the environmental community and frustration with the land trust that we were working with and we have been working with. And that frustration came because a lack of foundational understanding, as we saw it, of what it means to own land. And really pushing back on this idea that pre-contact Native people never owned land, that we simply lived on it and were hunter-gatherers merely existing in this space with no real management or ideas of ownership. I'm Yurok. We absolutely, unequivocally owned land. We understood land ownership. We understood transfer of ownership. We understood jurisdictional boundaries, and they were a part of who we were as Indigenous people. So it was frustrating to have conversations with folks who, one, didn't share our same values or understand who we were as a people, or the concepts that existed on this continent pre-contact. The other frustrating part about working with our land trust partners that we had is they believed in an idea of wilderness. And their goal was to get back to a point where everything was wild. Not pointing at you. Because the idea of wilderness, that there was a wild country, and that was our goal that we wanted to get to, we know is based on racism and the ideas of white supremacy. The idea that this continent could have been built, that our herds of buffalo and our runs of salmon could have been created, that our old-growth redwoods and our prairies were managed at a scale no European had ever seen before by the lowly savages here was too much. That had to be wilderness. That had to be wild. You only get to abundance if humans aren't a part of it? Because that's what we all saw when Europeans first came here, was this abundance. And so it had to be natural. It couldn't have been based on thousands of years of land management and horticulture and forestry management and herd management by the native people here. We wanted to find a place, a safe place that we could work in that understood these concepts in a way that we did. And it turns out the only space that we could find was the one that we created, one that we had to create out of necessity and frustration. So the Klamath Indigenous Land Trust works on the premises that the true connectivity that we have to aspire towards is our connectivity to the land. That we as humans are a part of the wilderness. And we have always created the ecosystems that we exist in. That has always been our responsibility. That has always been our job. And it has always been engineered. Always been engineered. And it's critical, absolutely critical, that we all understand the goal we're headed to. We have to be heading the same direction. We have to be heading towards the same place. And the frustration for me and my group of friends is it never felt like we were heading towards the same goal. We were not heading towards the same location. Our allies were heading towards a place that didn't exist and never existed. And although there were paths that aligned and we supported each other, absolutely, ultimately, we were never going to get where we wanted to go if we couldn't find a way and create a space where everyone agreed on what the goal was. So the goal of KILT is to reconnect humans to our responsibility to create ecosystems. Welcome.
Thank you both. Again, like I say, great place to start with, and thank you for sharing the personal experience and the frank talk. You may point at me, I can take it. You can point at anybody in this room. We're tough, aren't we? So I think, how much time have we got? 5 minutes. All right. There's as your host, I can tell you there's no secret gifts under your chair, but the gift is we have 5 minutes to ask questions. Has somebody got a question you'd like to share with our panel here? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely not. We feel like we are very much heading towards different directions. That the vast majority of the environmental community is still pushing towards a direction to restore a wilderness and to remove humans and our ability to continue our way of life. You see it in bills all the time. One just got passed, or it's on way to get passed last week. The state has numerous regulations that also set this in place. You see it over and over again on the comments made from most of the environmental community on bills regarding logging, fishing, and harvest. We are nowhere close to being on the same page. This is it. This is it. Showing up in spaces, having these conversations, building land trusts, building organizations, talking, having conversations, having our young people attend these schools and share their ideas. I feel like, as always, communicating and connecting one another is the best way to do it. So this is, I think, what most folks are trying to do.
I'll just add really quick. I was really shocked coming into conservation work more, or I don't know about shocked, but you hear a lot about restoration, and I heard very little about what you're restoring to, like what state is that? And I was, surprised how little evidence, academic people are making based on what state are we trying to achieve here. And like Frank was saying, it's an imaginary state, a state that's imagined before, I don't even know what, this wilderness idea with no people on the land. So when you're trying to restore property, think about that, I think. What are you trying to restore it to? I think oftentimes you're trying to restore it to a state when Indian people were managing it. And what does that mean for restoration of a site? That likely means don't exclude people from that place anymore. Could mean let Indians do Indian things in that place again. But yeah.
No, I think absolutely, no one is doing any bad work. We're not doing anything wrong. I think the restoration that we see being built, the restoration community we're seeing be developed, absolutely are doing the right things. I think the clarity of where that ends up is really, really important, because I think who owns the land is really, really important, and who does the work is extremely important. When we think about restoration, I know we think about the post work, but I think it's also really important to think about who does the work. Who does the work? Who is doing the work? Josh is going to talk later on today on the Klamath. We've seen a huge focus on not just restoration, but who's doing the restoration work. Who's actually out there, boots on the ground, hands in the dirt, implementing the projects. Because what we've learned is, turns out that's the real restoration that we needed to be focusing on, was returning the people to the land and who is doing it and who is working. And we have seen a dramatic difference between outcomes when it is Indigenous-led efforts, implemented projects versus non-Indigenous. And the difference is you are restoring the people to their not only place, but their jobs, what they're meant to do. A process that at the heart of genocide and boarding schools was to remove them from, right? The goal was to remove us from what our job here on Earth is to do, which is restore and maintain the balance of the ecosystems around us. So ensuring that we have a hyper focus on who's doing the work is critical. What contractors are you hiring? What engineer firms are you hiring? What laborers are you hiring? And also think about where that revenue is going, where those funding opportunities are to not only restore Indigenous people and tribal nations back to their jobs that most of us believe we were put here on Earth to do, but also where that revenue is going. There are hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on restoration. A very, very small percentage of that is actually going back to the people who has suffered greatest from the destruction of those resources. We have to start thinking differently. This has to be a part of our planning. When we think about restoration projects, when we think about what needs to get done, it has to be a priority. Who is doing it? And where is the revenue going? And how can we support the people who have suffered the most from it. It has to be on the same value as biodiversity. It has to be on the same value as where the funding comes from. We have to be thinking about it in the same way.
You just dropped it.
Thank you. Food for thought, honest and provocative. Thank you very much for sharing your views. You know, that safety is elemental. To be safe on the land. Who is here and who is leading and doing the work, benefiting from the resources and sharing in the benefits of all that. So we really appreciate your being here to help us think this through. We've got a lot of work to do, and we're going to step it down the line. Thank you so much. So as you've heard a couple times that how excited we are about what's been happening on the Klamath and the removal of the dams. My personal history in that is that one of the first things I got to do when I came to Oregon was look at alternatives to the dam services provided in the Snake River. So I dedicated myself to be a dam buster. And it was this dreamscape, right, in the mid-90s. How are we going to get big dams out of the rivers so the rivers can return to their function, the salmon can thrive, the systems can live again, and the people can live within the way they've always lived. So here we are now in 2025 with the remarkable situation that the Klamath is now flowing free. And to share some of how that's happening and what's the next step, the other thing that I learned in the Sandy River and in the Snake is that dam removal is only the beginning, right? It gets you back to a free-flowing river, but after that, in terms of restoration, there's tremendous amounts of work to do, and our next presenter, Josh Chenoweth, is helping to lead that effort and has done so not only in the Klamath, but in the Elwha River system, where he was in charge of helping to implement and design the revegetation and monitoring plan for Elwha dam removal in Washington on the Olympic Peninsula, one of the nation's premier dam removals until now, and one of the biggest until now. And so we've got, this is the biggest now, but then there's still some dams up there we can work on. So we're really excited to have Josh Chenoweth, who is a restoration ecologist from the University of Washington, an author and an educator. His work on the Elwha got the Yurok tribe's attention, so they dragged him down to help with the work down here, and he's going to tell us about how it's been happening, what's going to happen next, and how we've built this tremendous success. And so thank you, Josh Chenoweth, for joining us today.
Perfect. Thanks. Thank you for that. Yeah, when I came down here, I couldn't let something be bigger than the Elwha. I always have to be involved in the biggest. But maybe this is it. I don't know. So I got a lot of slides. I'm gonna just dive right in. 76 to be exact, but there's a lot of pictures. So pretty pictures. It's worth it. I promise. So why native seed, right? Obviously, you're doing a restoration project. I think most of us in this room are going to understand why native seed's important, but I always like to have slides like this to kind of open my talk on seed. Genetically appropriate, that's important, right? You want your seed to be genetically appropriate. You want it to be diverse, and that is going to facilitate successful restoration. What you can buy off the shelf is probably not any of those things, right? You might get native seed, but you don't know where it's from. It might not really belong where you're putting it as far as genetics. And what you do want is, if you are trying to look for something genetically appropriate, it's really hard to find. And of course, getting enough diversity is really hard, right? There's usually 5 or 6 major species on the market that you can purchase. And those same species are being introduced in every restoration project across the Northwest. So that's, a problem. So because of that, I kind of think we're actually potentially doing some harm in restoration if we aren't considering that diversity. Because again, we're just putting the same species out there in every site, probably the same genetics, and not a lot of diversity. And to me, that has consequences, right? Because what you put down matters long term. And of course, if you can get high diversity, high richness in your mix, and in your, if you're planting or seeding, you are going to have more ecological resilience. So there's a lot of studies throughout all of the ecology talking about species richness and their importance to your ecosystem. The more richness, which is really just the number of species present, the more resilient it is to change, and change is constant, right? Change is always happening. So having a species-rich system is should be your goal, right? So that it can handle change. So just sort of quick overview on the Klamath Dam Removal Project. It's quite a web of players. The project owner is Klamath River Renewal Corporation, a nonprofit. That's a partnership between the tribes, the state of Oregon, the state of California, and two nonprofits, and then the fisheries industry. And they hired out all of the work to contractors. Witt was the engineer removing the dams, and the restoration contract went to RES, Resource Environmental Solutions. And the Yurok tribe is a subcontractor to RES. And for the first 5 years, we were the technical lead. They changed up their management and now brought in some new folks that do a lot of that work starting last year. Everything we're doing is driven by a management plan called the RAMP. It outlines all our goals and objectives. So we're really, as far as the contractors are concerned, they're trying to fit into this box. And it directed us to produce enough native seed to seed the reservoirs twice. And so I designed that from the ground up, and we decided on a seeding rate of 80 to 100 PLS per square foot. If you're doing a seeding project, that's the measurement that you care about, right? It's how many seeds are being put down per unit, whatever it is. It's not the weight, because your seed mix could have a ton of really small seed species or really big species. It depends on the mix. So that per square foot is a common method for trying to calculate what you need. And so when you calculate it out, the acreage, which is around 2,000 times 2, it's around 18.6 billion seeds that you're going to need. And when I say PLS, if you're not familiar with that term, it's pure live seed. So that's the content of your seed that's considered viable. So for us, that's 60 to 90,000 pounds of seed. That's based on our different species that we've put into that mix. And we propagated for this project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, a lot of species, again, to get to that diversity. And it does matter how you seed, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but if you want to use a helicopter instead of hand seeding with tribal members on the ground, you need to triple that volume, because a helicopter needs to seed 50 pounds an acre. They don't care about your PLS per square foot. It's a weight issue in their mechanism. So we also collect seed to produce trees and shrubs. And again, everything was delegated. It had to be from the watershed or adjacent. So sometimes we were here in the Rogue Valley collecting, one watershed over. The re-veg implementation was supposed to be 2 years, starting as dam removal began, and then there's a 5-year maintenance and monitoring plan. So I'm going to try to speed through the selecting species, because a lot of people ask me, how do you pick your species that you're going to use? And there's lots of variables that go into that. And really, I've kind of boiled it down to this. So what are the species patterns out there? So for us, around those reservoirs, like what are you going to find, right? And is the seed available? So what's there, and then is there enough to actually collect? And is it feasible to propagate? Does it work in a seed increase field, or can you propagate it into a tree and shrub? And then is it likely to establish? Great if you get it, but maybe it doesn't do well from seed. An example would be sedges. You can go out and collect all the sedges you want. Maybe you can propagate it. Actually, that's a challenge as well as far as seed amplification. But if you try to direct sow it, you're not going to get much happening. It's going to take a long time, and it's probably not going to do whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And some of that establishment is, you have to consider things like, is it going to show up on its own? And if so, can it disperse long distances, or is it right there, really close to your site? Is there a seed bank? And what's the match? Is it going to actually happen in the right timeline? Is it going to actually happen when you want it to? So for us, we did a lot of plot work prior to dam removal, which was both part of the ramp. We needed some reference data, but also to kind of start looking at what was out there for seed collection, right? So most of our seed collection stuff was not just reference plots; it's wandering around the landscape. we looked for things like this. So this is chick lupin, really abundant. Lupins can be really valuable, especially if you're dealing with a primary successional restoration project, which this is, right? It was a lake. You pull it down and there's nothing there, right? There's a seed bank, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but this is stage 0, if you will, right? And so lupins are really awesome early seral, you know, first plants on your landscape, and they can really facilitate everything else afterwards. And great examples, Mount St. Helens. Some lupins showed up early on in that project, you know, not seeded, just showed up on its own and had a huge impact on the landscape. And on the Elwha, we saw this in play. This is riverbank lupin. This was part of our seed mix. We had these really difficult surfaces that we tried seeding things on, didn't do well. We did a little seed increase project on our own in our greenhouse with this species, and over time it took off and did this. And it facilitated everything else. There's studies since that have shown how it's affected plants that we've put in the ground. It's improved their growth. It's you know, everything's really thriving. This was like the first year where we kind of got a super bloom from it. And I wanted something like this potentially for the Klamath project. Seed availability, that's pretty straightforward, right? Can you get the seed? Here's a perfect example, antelope bitterbrush. It usually seeds pretty well, but I don't know if you've ever tried to collect that seed. Right when it's about to ripen, you know, it's easy to pop. Doesn't really after ripen, meaning you can't get it when it's, you know, before it drops. But right when it does ripen and it's ready, it just drops, right? So it's most of it doesn't stay on the shrub, and so trying to collect it is a challenge. You know, we'll have great years and we'll go out and we'll be watching it daily, and then finally we'll, you know, miss a day, maybe go out and do it, and they can get like 2 pounds, you know, which is not much. So seed availability can be challenging even if you have a lot of plants on the landscape. Things like fruits, you know, they can be super variable, as most of us know, right? A lot of species mast, they only will really produce seed every couple of years, so you have to factor that in. So we've had good years and bad years, and so that's thrown things into chaos. It's nice to have a good 5 years for a project like this because of that, right? You can't count on 1 year to be your seed collection year. Acorns, perfect example, right? We had a great year in 2020, nothing in 21, 22, and sure enough, 2023 was a banner year, which was awesome because dam removal started in 2024, and acorns don't stay viable very long. You want to put them in the ground within, you know, 4 or 5 months that you collect it. Propagation feasibility, you know, some of these species are really valuable. The lomatiums are an incredibly important cultural plant to a lot of the Klamath tribes, but they're really hard to propagate in a seed amplification field. And something like Sambucus nigra, also super valuable and important, and we've been trying to grow that my whole career, and most people struggle and can't give me a plant. Like I'll order 1,500 and I'll get 3. So really hard, but we still collect them, and we do what we can to try to push that envelope a little bit. Likelihood to establish is really going to be, in a project like this, it's going to be wind dispersed, right, during drawdown, or it's going to be a seed bank. So it's in the sediments, and as it's drawn down, you get germination. What we know from the Elwha was the wetland species are going to pop everywhere. We saw that happen on the Elwha. They can seed bank underwater because that's what they're ecologically adapted to do. They stay alive underwater. Upland species can't do that, right? They'll lose viability quickly because they don't have enough oxygen. And wind dispersed species, not a lot of opportunity around these reservoirs, mostly because it's grasslands and stuff, and you know, oaks are kind of a predominant species, and obviously that doesn't go very far. So we're really only thinking that we were really only counting on the wetland species to show up, which is great because I hate propagating wetland species and trying to reseed them, right? If they show up on their own, that's a benefit. This is what the Elwha looked like during, June was about 6 months after drawdown there. So these were all wetland sedges and rushes that showed up all on their own. You can kind of see there's a little monkey flower in there too. We saw something similar in 2020 during a drawdown event at Copco. You can see there's all of this. This is hydropiper. This is Persicaria hydropiper, not native, but a wetland species that just germinated right away during the drawdown experiment that was going on. And then actual drawdown, here's a control area. So this is an area that we left unseeded in Kopko, and all of these species germinated in situ, all wetland species. You know, a mix. Some of it's native, some of it's not native. So a lot can happen on its own, even though this is primary succession. Okay, seed collection and propagation. The project started collecting seed in 2018. That was a different organization that did the collection. It was Pacific Coast Seed. The Yurok tribe were brought on in 2019. Now the message for seed collection, if you need a lot of volume, you want 5 to 10 years before your project. Now most of us don't have to deal with this scale, but if you have to deal with this scale, that's super important, right? And really it's all about that propagation side. We had 5 years to do it, not because they gave me 5 years or because they planned for 5 years, but because dam removal kept getting delayed. And I kept saying, thank the Lord. You know, I don't have enough seed. If you're going to amplify your own seed, you have to collect it. That's year one, right? If you're lucky, you get everything in year one. But as I showed you, that doesn't happen. So then you send it to your field. And we sent it to 5 different vendors in 3 states because, again, no one place could probably propagate as much as we're asking for, right? We wanted in that 60 to 80,000 pounds. And then they start growing it. So maybe they put it in the ground in year 2. And if you're lucky, you start getting some seed in year 3 if it's a perennial, right? And then they harvest off that for a few years. And so for us, after 5 years of growing, we got to 72,253 pounds. Right? And again, scattered over 3 states. Now, a little example of how you need to do this kind of strategy and think about it as early as possible, start growing, is one of our growers, Heritage Growers, and that's in down in California, in Colusa, California. I asked them how much they produced last year. I was at a tour earlier this spring, and they said they produced a total of 30,000 pounds. So their whole facility only produced 30,000 pounds in 1 year, and they sell to lots of people. So it's an example of how you're not going to get everything you want in 1 year or with one grower. You're going to have to, spread that out. The project actually added to that. They went out and bought another 80,000 pounds of seed because they wanted to do helicopter seeding. So again, this project was originally designed to be hand seeded. As we got closer, there was some nervousness, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so they said, oh, we need more seed because, again, 50 pounds an acre for a helicopter, that would have blown all our seed really quickly. And so they went out and bought off-the-shelf, native grass species. They were lucky it was not a big fire year, and it was actually available because they literally bought it about a month before they needed it, which is not how you want to do things. But, sometimes that's what happens in restoration, right? We have to wing it. So far, this project's had 152,000 pounds available for seeding. We also did do some wild collecting. So again, those species that didn't do well in propagation, we didn't ignore them. We collected them, and the crews, we would just stash them. And that's where we had a partnership with the Rogue Native Plant Partnership at Selberg Institute, and we cleaned in their facility, and we just stored it. We took over a whole freezer. Thank you for the freezer. And then we used this seed to kind of supplement and add some diversity in strategic locations during the seeding process. We ended up with 175 pounds of that from 18 different species, and again, designed to supplement the mixes. A lot of bare root and container propagation. That's not really been as successful as we'd like, not because we couldn't propagate it, but because of Phytophthora. So I think I do talk about, I might have slides a little later. Phytophthora, we have to test for Phytophthora, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But we also did some herbaceous plug productions because some of the species, again, don't do well from seed. So to add diversity, we did actually grow some herbaceous plants as plugs and introduce them that way. And also you get another year, right, of it matures faster, right? Maybe it's already going to flower if it's a perennial that first year. And so that could be an advantage of using herbaceous plugs. Yeah, I guess I skipped it. So there was a slide on Phytophthora. It might have been a new one that I didn't add to this one. But basically, Phytophthora, sudden oak death, you have to be worried about that in California. We had to test for Phytophthora. So when we were doing bare root production, we actually managed to produce 120,000 in year 1 and about 120,000 in year 2. About 80% of that tested positive for Phytophthora, so we couldn't use it. So we were way behind on our planting goals. 2 lessons learned from that. One, probably use a nursery that's not going to have Phytophthora, which is tricky, right? Bare roots tend to be the worst place for Phytophthora because it's hard to keep your entire landscape free of it, right? And there's 40 species to worry about. The second one is don't use the Agdia immunostrips. So there's a rapid test for Phytophthora. The cheapest one out there is done by the company Agdia, and it's an immunostrip designed for Phytophthora. That's what we used, and then we did a follow-up this year where we were sending our plants to OSU to really get a second opinion, and then the Forest Service, because we used J. Herbert Stone for the growing, they did their own testing using Pocket Diagnostic, a different rapid test. They could not find Phytophthora, and they were testing the ones that we said, here, these are positive for Phytophthora, and they retested them and did not find it. OSU also didn't find it. So the Agdia immunostrips were finding root rot, and root rot can falsely flag for Phytophthora in the Agdia immunostrips. So don't use that one. And then the other one is there is a new program out there. It's big in California, or it's growing, I should say. It's called the AIR program, and that is an effort by UC Davis to try to ensure good nursery practices to ensure that there's no Phytophthora in your plants. So if you buy from an AIR nursery, an AIR certified nursery, then it's doing all that to try to prevent Phytophthora. So I recommend that. It's a lot more expensive, and that's one of the problems, right? You're not going to get 45 cents a plant. You're going to be paying $5 to $10 a plant. Okay, so developing seed mixes. I have a lot of seed mixes. This is an example of one, right? So, not the same mix for everywhere, and mostly that's just because you end up with all these different species, and it'd be really nice to just make one upland seed mix and one riparian, but the problem is you only have so much of this species and so much of that species, and you have 2,000 acres, so you start to go, okay, well, this is more likely to be south-facing in a grassland, and this is more likely to be rocky, whatever it is, right? And so this is an example of one of my mixes, the grassland mix. We have 20 species in there, so again, high species richness, 11 forbs, 9 grasses for south-facing slopes. And the key here is that we wanted to make sure we're providing some kind of pollinator habitat for the whole growing season. And so when you look at our mix, this is highlighting just the forbs. Obviously we got all these grasses. I just didn't highlight them because it tends to not be a pollinator habitat. It doesn't provide pollinator habitat. But as you can see, our mixes are designed, and actually, the Amsinkia really does start earlier. This was last year's observations, and a lot of these, and we also have a few others that are going a little earlier. So we have stuff blooming out there from March, actually into November, which is awesome. And some of the species are night bloomers, like the Menzelia. So that's what you want, right? You want not only to provide diversity of plants, but now you're increasing the diversity of pollinators, right? And you're providing hopefully an opportunity for that diversity to naturally increase. All right, so revegetating the reservoirs. I'm doing pretty good. 250,000 pounds of seed have been sown so far, and I'm going to kind of walk you through that a little bit. So as I mentioned, there's hand seeding. That's just broadcast seeding, right? Like that's all it is. You're just literally throwing the seed out onto the landscape. We don't use belly grinders. We don't do anything like that. You're less than ideal. So your ideal is like you've got a few species you're drill seeding, right? Or you're using some sort of equipment that can ensure good seed to soil contact. Your next is hand seeding or broadcast seeding, any kind of broadcast seeding, right? And then your third is helicopter seeding. And each one increases the amount of seed you need, right? So if you're using drill seeders and you only have a few species in it, it's gonna not need as much pounds per acre. Hand seeding a little bit more because again, you don't have good seed to soil contact, and then helicopter the most. I like hand seeding, especially on a big landscape. And there's one of our tribal members seeding, and it was all my crew, our tribal members, and they did all this work from collection to planting and seeding. 6 mixes, so 2 riparian and 4 upland in year 1. I think the lowest was 11 species. That was my wetlands mix because I knew I was going to have a lot of wetland species, so I really didn't care as much. And a lot of the species in that mix are both upland and riparian. And some wild collected were added in year 1. We were targeting 150 pure live seeds per square foot in the upper rim. And the idea there was we were going to create a nice dense buffer of native vegetation to kind of help defend against all the invasive species directly upslope. The rest of the landscape, 100 PLS per square feet. A common number is 80. Some people do 30 to 60. It really does depend on your environment and how you're seeding. This is kind of what it looked like. So we were tasked with about 900 and something acres during drawdown, but what we found was a couple things. We were limited a little bit to the potential for refilling, and so we kept our hand seeding areas to the area that we knew wasn't going to refill during the spring freshet, right? And then the second variable for us was how muddy is it? And in the Elwha, we were able to walk around within weeks of drawdown. And it was a really slow drawdown process there, and we were boating around, getting out, and putting plants in the ground. This landscape, the sediments that have covered the reservoirs in the last 100 years were so heavy in clay, like 80% clay in some places, versus 20% on the Elwha, meant that you really sank, right? You were sinking in anywhere that it was deep. And we were trying to seed well into March, and we were still sinking. So we were really only able to do the upper edges. The higher slopes tended to be less sediment prone, right, because of that rocky wake zone. The wave action from, the reservoir operations made it less, you didn't sink as much. And we were able to start June 15th. So the reservoir's first drawdown was like June 12th, and we were out there right away. And we just sort of what we could do safely, right? And so it wasn't ideal. We were doing skinny little rims, and then we'd come back, okay, now we can walk on this. But we managed to get 16,000 pounds of seed on the ground. And again, the lower slopes we weren't really able to do. This is kind of what it looked like. This is Copco, and you can see this is just soup. It just stayed this way well into March at Copco. And then, of course, J.C. Boyle did this to us over and over again, and so that kept it really wet, right? It would snow, and then the snow would slowly melt, and it just kept it saturated. So Res used a helicopter to get the rest. It was a little late. If we had used the helicopter right away, we might have had a little bit more success, but I'll show you a little bit about that. And so they just took care of all that stuff using a very low diverse seed mix, right? The 6 to 8 species they were able to get off the shelf that was available in December. 6 to 8 species, and it was 45 pounds an acre. They just negotiated it down because it's expensive. So they did about 1,500, again, late seeding. So year 2, we did another round of seeding because that's what the ramp said to do. So we did. I don't know that it was entirely necessary, but what we ended up doing is splitting that rocky wake zone into a really rocky and less rocky. And so I had species that were wild collected that ended up in this blue. And so this is what the Yurok tribe seeded this year. This section, we did seed a bunch last year, and I'm not entirely sure if Res seeded this part, but we're going here tomorrow. So that's why I decided to use this picture. We're going to park right there and walk out onto this landscape. And so this year we did about 519 acres. We could have done more, but Res chose to do the rest using mechanical methods. And so the only thing we really did was this upper area that didn't get messed with, and then we did areas that were of cultural importance or that they couldn't get their equipment into to do their seed prep. What Res did this year was they did a lot of seed prep. So they used, this is called a renovator, and they also used bulldozers to take this surface and turn it into this. Because if you're going to introduce seed in year 2, you didn't want to seed on top of this kind of concrete, cracked surface. A lot of the seed would probably end up in here. In some places, those cracks are 3 feet deep. So then your seed's not even going to do anything. And then they went back through after doing that and either seeded via helicopter in late December, or they used their drill seeder, which is this little, it's not a true drill seeder. It's got, kind of like a cultipacker in front, kind of break it up right before it drops the seed, and then it breaks it up in the back, which in theory is going to bury the seed a little bit, right? Now, the only drawback, in my opinion, to this is you have 20 some odd species in there. I think the little seed is going to get too buried. All right, and so that can be the problem with this approach. If you're not broadcast seeding, now you're favoring the bigger seed, inadvertently. We did a lot of planting, so 119, I think this is where I talk about Phytophthora. Sorry. 119,000 plants so far. So 75,000 last year, 43 this year. Huge disappointment because so much was lost to Phytophthora, honestly. Acorn planting has been much better, much more successful. We collected 1,500 pounds in 2023. Half of that was produced into 1-year-old trees to be planted, and the other half was directly sown in the reservoir. And year 2, everything we collected, except for some of the black oak, was directly sown into the reservoirs. And then we also had a little bit of showing milkweed in that first year, try to really boost that, pollinator habitat. And everything we planted were in what we call facilitation patches, which is just, we try to create, packed in areas that we can then manage, and hopefully those dense patches will really facilitate survival. So I already mentioned this. There's a picture of the immunostrip that you should not use, okay? And this one's fine. This one seems to work. And then this is a little link to the air nursery. So great website. If you just Google air nursery, you'll probably find this page. But it's a good program, and hopefully more nurseries will join it in the future. All right, hand seeding results. We started getting germination right away. So we started seeding January 15th, and by February 9th, we're already getting some germination. This is all last year during the drawdown. We had rapid growth. So one of the things that we saw on the Elwha was residual moisture benefits your seeding. So sure enough, things grew rapidly. They really liked the wet sediment. You can see the cracking hasn't really happened. It's starting, but there's still a lot of growth on the surfaces. And sure enough, it really started to boost. And by May, this is what we were looking at last year. I mean, it blew me away, honestly. It did way better than I expected. Here's some before and afters. They're far more fun, right? So here's us seeding the very first site in January. And then here it is in May, same site. So, I mean, we're talking better cover than in your natural grasslands. Here's another before and after. This is at Fall Creek, kind of looking at the surface before. Again, just exploded. Not everywhere exploded. So here's a site in Copco. And you can take a look at this and this. So this was hand seeded. This was helicopter seeded. The hand seeding didn't do quite as amazing as everything else. There's a lot of growth there, but things aren't quite as big and happy. And of course, you can see the helicopter seeding, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's another spot. There's a before, there's an after, and then this year I tried to get that picture again already. And I'll talk a little bit about how things are evolving this year, but really, it's sustaining itself in the hand seeded areas. Here's a picture in March, and so you can see last March, even though they're really small, it's already starting to green up in those hand-seeded areas. And this same site this year looks like that this past March. So what I think really happened was not our secondary seeding, it seeded itself, right? All the annuals seeded themselves, the perennials just got bigger, and a lot of stuff that we didn't see blooming last year is blooming this year. The helicopter, this was a hit or miss, right? They did it really late. Now, you don't want to seed in March, probably in most places. Maybe Western Washington, you can get away with it. But they did get germination, again, because of that residual moisture. It was really wet. We were sinking. Seed likes that. You can see how it doesn't get great coverage. You can see the pattern the helicopter took, back and forth. So that's one of those Copco flats that was really wet. It looked like a golf course, which, maybe you want to play golf out there. The holes are a problem. The cracks are a problem. But really good at Jenny. So when we're driving around, you'll probably see that. This is what it looked like in June. So these flats, again, really took off, 100% cover, but again, kind of limited in its species richness. Here's a look at a lot of the sites, right? So those were the good sites that I showed you. Here's a lot of the landscape that was helicopter seeded in that first year. So not much, whereas the hand-seeded areas really did awesome. And it was probably mostly timing, not method, right? It was just that we did it right away, and the helicopter didn't do it till March. This year, they went through and track walked, and so you can see the tracks. They literally drive a bulldozer up and down, perpendicular to the slope, and it makes these ruts. And sure enough, then they helicopter seeded, and they did it right before Christmas, which was still a little late in my opinion. but it looks really good, right? I mean, as far as growth, it looks funny, but it looks, you know, you're getting growth. And this has all the seed, right? This is full diversity mix. This isn't just the 6 seeds again, or, you know, 6, 7 species. Not everywhere looks great. There really went to town on some of these surfaces that were flat, and they would go through their cultipacker sometimes a couple times. They were obsessing over the size of the, you know, particles when they were done, and then they seeded it. And so this picture was taken just, you know, you could see the development where we hand seeded versus where they were able to get the machine is very different. And so in some places, I think this over-treatment was not a positive, and I think it was timing. So they were doing this well into December. You know, stuff was germinating that, you know, from last year's flowers in October. So now you're destroying those new germinants, right? And you're then putting seed down late, and you worked it so much that I think a lot of the seed is just so small it wasn't really able to pop up through. In other places, they did that. Like here's where they did the timing right? They finished this site early. So here they used that drill seeder, but they were done in October. And here's the hand seeded areas. That was, you know, a cultural site, so they weren't allowed to touch that. And so you can hardly tell a difference. So really timing was kind of the key. And here's just a quick overview of Iron Gate, a pretty picture for you. It looks pretty good. This was taken just this past May, you know, early this month. We'll talk a little bit about this. That's willow. And really the take-home message, and Rez, you know, this is Rez's take-home message, and I agree with it, is basically germination establishment is really variable. So we can't really nail down the method or, you know, timing. It's kind of, there's probably also site conditions that are going to be a factor in this. But if you did it while it was still saturated, you'll get great results, and you could probably be done. We did do some monitoring, and what was really cool in the hand-seeded areas, we were able to identify 19 of the 22 species that we hand-seeded, and 17 had at least flowered, you know, at least I found one flower out there. And this year, just walking around, I've seen far more flowering. So more species, and also more flowering from the species that I'd find like one flower, right? Like Elamis spiccatus or Festuca idahoensis, like some of the grasses. They just kind of hung out as tufts last year, right? Because it was kind of, you know, they're perennials and it was late, and they just kind of built the root system. And then this year they're going crazy. They're flowering, they're getting bigger. It's actually really awesome out there, again, in the hand-seeded areas. Cover was really high. So average was 78% in Copco. Iron Gate, it's 38%, but that's because we did do a lot of areas that were in the helicopter zone. And in the helicopter areas in J.C. Boyle, they got a little bit better results. It was still patchy, though. Reference plots, the grasslands, they were a little lower. They got seeded a little later. Oak woodlands had pretty good cover. And just as a contrast, on the Elwha, we only had 40% cover in year 1, and the Elwha re-veg was wildly successful. Now, we didn't seed right away on the Elwha. We waited a year. But the natural regeneration really drove that project. And despite, you know, year 1 isn't really telling you much. It's really what happens in 2, 3, 4, 5 that matters. Here's some highlights. So Menzies Fiddleneck has been a real winner out there. It was only 2% of my seed mix, and yet it's 26% of the cover, and it's all over the place. My crew kind of hates it because it hurts to walk through. So be careful. We'll learn that tomorrow. You're going to experience that. Poppy, as we all know, is out there doing really well. Squirrel tail is an awesome species. Here's the chick lupin. So it is kind of doing, in some places, what I was hoping a lupin would do. It's an annual, and it's really bringing in the pollinators, right? It's bringing nitrogen into the system. There it is in Wanaka Springs. And, of course, it's setting seed. And this year I went out and looked, and there was, you know, I was watching it in February, and there were seedlings everywhere. So it's naturalizing. Doesn't need us to add the seed again every year. This year I've been out there, and we added some silverbush lupin to just a couple areas in front of like people's properties last year, and they are doing great. So, you know, a small amount, right? Like less than a seed per square foot, and you find them frequently, and they're blooming. They're going crazy. We also seeded a little bit of royal penstemon, and then the penstemon roeslii also finally blooming. They're out there. I can find them. It's easy. And so that to me was super exciting. I get very excited when I see these things. again, we talk about how this is you know, the whole growing season matters, right? So here's a picture in August, and it looks like, you know, there's our hand-seeded areas. It doesn't look like anything happening, but when you get down on the landscape, sure enough, Grandelia is blooming, vinegar weed really did well, blazing stars all over the place. It's doing really well. I found it going to seed in year 1. It's a biennial, so you don't really expect it to do that, but sure enough, it was going crazy. JC Boyle, more variable success. So here's a hand-seeded area, did pretty good. And then super variable for helicopter. So here's a place where 100% cover, and then you get a place where it's, you know, not quite as great, and deep cracks, and, you know, there's some wetland species kind of mixed in with the festucas. Lots of natural regeneration. So we did see the wetland species show up. 50 different species have naturally appeared out there that I identified last year. It's low cover generally. You know, there's spots where it's heavy cover, but mostly it's low cover. Persicaria is kind of the biggest one. It's not native, but I'm not worried about it because wetland species are not going to persist, right? It's not a wet place. It's a hot and dry place. Reed canary grass, super abundant. That one maybe is more of a concern, again, only in wet places, but we all know how that can monoculture. But willow is kind of the fun story, and I know SOU is looking at this in a little more detail. We saw something similar on the Elwha, but here's a huge area of willow. So the willow, they love dam removals, right? And if you time it right, the willow seeds floating around, you know, spring and, you know, snow and summer. And if it hits these wet surfaces, it's going to germinate and it's going to love that place, right? And so this site is just upstream of the Iron Gate, where the Iron Gate Dam used to be. And of course, drawdown was through a tunnel. And so during the spring freshet, it would actually back up water. And so there was a little lake behind it until they removed that tunnel. And it was slowly drying out as the flows come down during that spring freshet, which sure enough is May and June. And this is what happened. It just laid down pure stands of willow. And for those, I know SOU was looking at heights. I did throw in a picture of somebody staring at the willow. This is a total willow nerd. His name's John Bear. His daughter's name is Salix. So every once in a while, he's like, yeah, Salix, you know, and he's like, I'm talking about the plant, not my daughter. He couldn't believe the heights, so I made him stand there. All right, so there's a reference. We were cutting willow stakes for a project this spring because they're going to do some work on the high priority tribs. We were able to selectively cut the 8-footers, a 1-year-old plant. So, and all species are there, although this is mostly red willow, and there are acres and acres of it. So when you're going on your field trip tomorrow and you first see the reservoir as you climb up the mountain, you know, climb up the hill, just look straight down, and you're going to see these just flats with lots of green. That's all willow. I don't have a lot of planting results just because we're sort of, you know, that's something we want to assess, you know, maybe later this year for the first time. I have wandered around and seen some places that are pretty good. And I think it's really associated with how close it is to the original soils. When we planted a little bit farther out where the sediment was deeper, those sites almost universally died. And I think a lot of that was like it cracked. Sometimes it exposed those roots, right? There was no crack when we planted it, but then as it dried, it cracked and kind of exposed the roots. There's some survivors, but really most of the good survival places are in places where they're shallowly cracked and it's close to the old soil surface. Our acorns, everywhere I go to look for them, I find something happening. So again, I haven't done a full assessment because a lot of those places last year, the veg was so tall, I didn't want people stepping on them. So we kind of wait until they're a little bigger. And I think SOU is going to help potentially do a survey later this fall where we try to relocate some of those and just see how much is actually there. We do, this is a one slide just saying, yeah, we are paying attention to invasives. You know, invasives aren't a problem usually early on because they weren't there yet, but we are out there assessing. We have an early detection rapid response program. Yellow star thistle in last year's data seemed to be the most common one other than cheatgrass, which is a long complicated story that I'll tell you about off later if you're interested. But star thistle, and it's really mostly just right close to the shoreline, right, where it was really easy to access. And we're thinking this year will be worse because the horses were able to get in all late last year, and they were probably dragging the seed in on their hooves, and I imagine it's going to be worse. We do have fencing up now, but We didn't last year until September sometime. Rican Canary grass is probably, again, the worst one because it's seed banked and just germinated and was everywhere. But I'm not worried about it in the uplands. It's going to die. It's not going to behave like an invasive. It's just going to be down by the river and in flats. Yeah, I managed to get through. So wasn't too bad for 76 slides. Sure. So the question was, are horses at all helpful, and what can we do about them, right? Including their reproduction that's occurring. That's a super challenging one, right? So land ownership is the biggest problem, right? The Pacific Corps owns a certain amount of land, and it's open graze. So to keep horses out, you have to fence. It's your responsibility to fence them out. So the fencing is our best weapon against them. Horses are not helping. I wouldn't say they're the worst. I think cows are worse. So what we saw from horse impacts, we'd go through, and a lot of the species they wouldn't eat, right? Or maybe they'd nip. They tend to just nip. They don't usually like pull the roots out. They do a little tilling for you. So I'd go, in fact, the site we're going to tomorrow is in an area where they didn't do any seedbed prep, but the horses were there. And so it'll be interesting. I kind of wandered through and go, oh yeah, they kind of tilled for us, and we saw lots of good regeneration. So I would say that the impacts weren't necessarily devastating. What I would say is that grazing from any ungulate out there is going to push your ecosystem into a non-native dominated grassland. And that's mostly because Medusa head really loves it out there, and it's not edible. They don't eat it. Star thistle, same thing. And cheatgrass. So those three species would be favored to kind of then take over these open spaces. They definitely love the native grasses. And so as far as like trying to do something to reduce the herd size and stuff, that's really a CDFW issue, right? Not KRC. I will say that the owner of the horses, and it is actually run by, it is supposedly a horse rescue location, right? The horses didn't show up on their own and start reproducing. They are brought there to a horse rescue guy, and the horse rescue guy says, thank you for your horse, and then lets them go. And it really got out of control in the last couple of years. I mean, there was 150 or more out there at any one time. We think we saw them leaving the site in trucks this year, and now we don't see as many. And so the fencing might have discouraged him, and maybe he realized there's too many. They're still out there, but there aren't as many. So, what? How many horses? Well, so last year there were at least 150 at any one time in the reservoir footprint. There was a lot. And when I was first out there in 2019, I'd be lucky to see 15 or 20, right? And then every year it was a little bit more, and it really just exploded. And I've heard some people say there was over 200. You'd see tons of babies every year. This year I have not seen more than like 12 at a time.
Off the top of your head, do you know how much the cost for your seed mix is per pound per acre?
Yes, so our seed mix, we're estimating, including the cost of collecting that initial seed, is around $50 a pound. So it's expensive. And I will say, 72,000 pounds were produced. Yeah. And I'll say this, so like if you buy off the shelf, you're probably, if you're lucky, you're paying like $12 a pound. That's only if you get it from BFI or River Refuge, you might get in that range. If you try to buy seed in California, you're paying at least $26 a pound. And our seed mix, you know, I made it sound like every single seed was collected by my team. That's not entirely true. Some of the species that we found sources that were in the Klamath that were in commercial production at BFI. And so we said, great. You know, we literally, it was like not far from J.C. Boyle. So we were like, well, that's a great seed source as long as it doesn't go past G4. So that's 4 generations, you know, being grown in the field before you try to go back to a wild source and start over. And they track that, and so they make sure it's less than G4. So we used a lot of the species in here, like the squirrel tail, the festuca, the June grass, were those species. So we didn't have to do the collection piece on those. We had to do everything else. We had to pay the cost of maintaining the field and then the cost per pound. Whereas if you just buy off the shelf, you're just paying the cost per pound. You're not paying any fees to manage the fields. Yeah, so that's a good question. I know Resource Environmental Solutions, is like they walk around and like, there's not enough grasses growing here. I'm kind of in a different camp. You know, this is a snapshot in time. This is primary succession. I wouldn't worry about it for a while. I would watch it evolve. You know, there's going to be some changes. There's a lot out there. In 90% of the landscape where we hand seeded, the diversity is high. Can I go stand and point at something that just has like fiddleneck? Probably. But I'm not super worried about it. I think it's really the changes over time that you start to want to maybe start getting involved. And really what it comes down to me, is do you want to disturb the site again? And what is your benefits? And if you don't know the answer, then you shouldn't do it. And we don't, right? There's these sites that aren't responding, but nobody knows exactly why. And so to me, it's like, well, let's just back off a little, maybe do some experiments. You know, they kind of went hog wild this year with their equipment and try to do it on every inch they could. And I think it would have been better to have done smaller pieces, got it done earlier, and watched, and then learned from it, and then done more the next year. You know, on the Elwha, our implementation was 7 years for that very purpose: adaptive management, learn. This project was like cram it into 2 and then monitor, which is the wrong approach on this, in my opinion. So we map them. What's that? Oh, what do we do about the invasives? So we map them. We're supposed to have early detection rapid response, which means get in there, find out where they are before they do anything bad, like reproduce, and then grub them. So we usually, like on a scale like this, like last year we walked through the Rocky Wake Zone, that upper edge, and we were able to just pull everything because it wasn't that abundant. This year, you know, and there's some species we couldn't, like reed canary grass. So it is a species-specific approach. Sometimes we do have to use herbicide. So far, we haven't had to in the footprint, although this year we should be doing it with reed canary grass. So
here's a question. I'm a disciple of Yoda, who said, failure your greatest teacher is. And I noticed that the J.C. Boyle propagation rate was about half the other areas. So 2 questions. You talked about timing, you talked about mud condition, you talked about penetration of soil and things. What do you think it might be some of the factors that you could change? And is it because that reservoir was named for the project manager of the dams? So
cursed.
Bad karma.
J.C. Boyle is a good question. So J.C. Boyle is worse this year. So they went in and did all that prep. And so some of the areas that had some growth don't have any now. I don't know why. They timed that one well. So the timing was fine at J.C. Boyle. We were hand seeding half, and they did their drill seeding on the other half, and it was all done before, late October, right? That should be perfect. But for some reason, there is nothing going on. It could be the sediment. There's the really low pH, but that shouldn't affect germination. That should affect growth. I'm just not seeing much germination. So there's a lot of questions that are unanswered up there. I will say that places that they couldn't prep are doing fine. And so where we hand seeded and they weren't allowed in there because of cultural issues are doing great. I don't necessarily blame the seed prep, but it certainly contributed to its current condition and didn't help it get better. But I don't know. That one's, don't go there to look at our success. You could check KRC's website. Oh, yeah.
Communicate with the project if you go out and find something that you don't want to see. Remember?
Yeah, so KRC's website might have some contact info on there. I will say it's a little clunky. I'll give you my card. How's that?
Just connecting this back to the previous talk, is there any movement towards like a land back or at least a safe space for gathering for Indigenous peoples on this project?
Is there plans for land back or space for gathering, but by Indigenous peoples?
Yes. All of Copco footprint and the Fall Creek area around Iron Gate are being given back to the Shasta Nation. The rest, I'm not sure what's happening at J.C. Boyle. The rest of Iron Gate is supposed to, I think, go to CDFW. The UROC are obviously in it for the long haul, and they've purchased property around it, and they're doing projects above the footprints in the next 5 years, assuming the NOAA money doesn't totally dry up. And I think that's the next step, right? Is like, how do we then bring exactly what Frankie said? How do we bring cultural use back onto the landscape? What does that look like? What do we need to maybe add that might be culturally relevant that wasn't successful? Those are all next steps, really, and that's not part of any plan that I've seen as far as like, RES and KRC. That's really would be driven by Frankie and Shasta.
My editorial comment for those of us living on the so-called Oregon side of the line, I believe there's acreage on the Oregon side of the line that has not yet been designated for what will happen to it. And so perhaps we have an opportunity to encourage our state decision makers to look at land back for those lands also. My editorial comment. You have a question there.
Just a comment. My hat is off to you. Herculean effort. Really incredible. In a former incarnation 30 years ago, some associates and I started the North Coast Seed Bank between Eureka and Arcata. We were specializing in taifa and sedges and a bunch of other wetland restoration seed. For you to gather the amount of seed you gathered and distributed, just phenomenal. And your attention to detail and your controls and your flexibility, just really exemplary. Hats off to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great note. Wait, one more. One more.
I can't help it. It's the invasive species nerd in me. But I just need to know, when you're doing these methods, which is really interesting that you have Nancy machinery, when you're talking about a species like star thistle or cheatgrass that loves disturbance, are you doing any examination of which method is actually, you're doing a huge amount of seeding, and then there's the secondary phase of protecting your plantings. Are you studying like which method is causing the greatest invasion?
So the question is, are we looking at the methods of seeding that are causing the greatest invasion from the seed nerd perspective?
Yeah, those are great questions. I'd say the one real problem with this project is that it doesn't have a lot of academic partners. The monitoring is always the hardest dollar to come by, right? And so this project does have monitoring money. It's not supposed to officially start till next year. In fact, last year I was like, we need to monitor. And Rez was like, no, we don't have to monitor. So the Yurok tribe funded me last minute to go out and get some data, right? So the idea that they'd fund like a study like that is unlikely because of financial concerns. So like on the LWA, we always had tons of partners, and that was just because of proximity, I think. We had University of Washington, Western Washington University, Olympia, and all of its universities. And so people kept coming to us. Here, nobody's come to us except Chaya from SOU. Yay, Chaya. Who was also a student up at the LWA, one of my interns. So I think that's the kind of thing that would be perfect for academia to look at, as far as like, resources, data collection, managing the data, and doing the analysis. And right now we don't have much of that at all. But maybe Chaya will do that. I'm gonna give it to Chaya.
Well, thank you, Josh. break, and then we'll pick up on the wonderful subject of highway crossings and the importance of monitoring. So don't go away. Come on back in 10 minutes and we'll get started. Thanks. Me though. All right, so on to other amazing accomplishments. That was just a tremendous story of what's going on in the restoration down the Klamath. Now we have what I call the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Miracle. We've got a trio of presenters, or actually 4 presenters here coming up. I'll introduce them all at once, and then you'll hear from them. Amy Amrine is the co-coordinator of the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Coalition. Remember, we talked about the power of coalition at the beginning. This one has incredible power because it has helped to create the world's fastest wildlife crossing project construction. You'll hear more about that. Amy worked for Senator Merkley for a long time. She was the regional organizer for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters. And most of all, she worked on the Ashland School Board. It's like the old Andy Griffith thing that said, never mess with the ladies' auxiliary, the local power of people who are organizers and can get things done. So Amy's going to talk with us about how all this came together. Jack Williams is a science leader among nonprofits and public agencies and an author. He wrote a book called Standing Between Life and Extinction, Ethics and Ecology of Conserving Aquatic Species in North American Deserts. So I really like that idea about ethics and ecology. We've talked about that it takes the ethic of commitment. And so all these things happen because we have both skills, science, and ethics working together. Dan Roberts is coming from the Oregon Department of Transportation, an exceptional partner in this. I was so impressed about how everybody from the agency was on board, supportive, saw the vision of the wildlife crossing, and has just gotten tremendous work done to make it happen. And then Karen Mager is the Associate Professor of Environmental Science, Policy, and Sustainability. Again, those factors that work together. A specialist as a wildlife ecologist and focuses on how roads affect connectivity for a diversity of species. How appropriate. And also you'll find there's this question about what's the importance of monitoring. Karen will also talk about pre-project and post-project monitoring, where we've had a unique opportunity to do that here. So without further ado, Amy Amrine at the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Coalition, my hero.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Okay, well, I'm going to go right to it, if I can work the thing. Okay, so we are a coalition of 17 organizations and agencies listed there. I want to point out specifically the Oregon Wildlife Foundation. When we all got together in my living room in 2021, we all decided that we did not want to start another nonprofit, that we did not want to get involved in any kind of bureaucracy. I'm a volunteer. This is my retirement gig. Jack Williams, same situation. I think it was Sydney from Oregon Department of Transportation recommended we contact the Oregon Wildlife Foundation up in Portland, and they are our fiscal sponsor. So they have helped us with fundraising and applications for grants, and they have been integrally involved in all of this. Each and every one of our organizations has contributed financially or voluntarily and have been integrally involved in all of our success. Sorry for this busy slide, but I'm going to run through our timeline here. I'm going to take this off. Okay. As I mentioned, in February 2021, we got together. This involved a small group that rapidly grew of scientists and advocates for the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. Michael Parker, Dave Willis, Jack, many others of us who love this place. We had talked for many years about building, this is Dave Willis's issue of tunneling under the Siskiyous for some sort of connectivity connection, allowing the animals to go over the top. I said, okay, that's ridiculous. That's never going to happen, Dave. Don't stop talking about it. But maybe we can get a wildlife crossing. So we built a coalition. Nobody said no, and people were coming, and agencies were coming at us from left and right, and we just said, yes, you're in, yes, you're in, yes, you're in. Again, Oregon Wildlife Foundation, huge impact on what we did. In the summer and fall of 2021, we started fundraising because we decided we needed a feasibility study looking at the whole 14 miles. What we were looking at was from Ashland to the California border. And I was a bit naive when I started this, but I said, oh, we'll just pick a spot and we'll go do it. And again, Jack and Tim Grethus with the Wildlife Foundation said, no, you got to have a study. You got to do this, you know, you got to have some backing behind what you want to do. So we did that. And 2021 to the present, BLM and SOU set up trail cams. And Karen and Sean are going to talk a lot more about that, about our monitoring and what we're doing with that. And Charlie was still working with the BLM, and he was integrally involved in getting that set up. We did do, 2022, we did our concept design study with the Samara Group and the River Design Group, again recommended by Tim Grethus with the Oregon Wildlife Foundation. This took 9 months. Many of you here probably were contacted about what you thought and what our goals were and where we were thinking we might want to put locations. So that took 9 months to compile. It completed in December 2023. We prioritized 2 sites, the Mariposa Preserve and the Barron Creek site. We turned over the design to the Oregon Department of Transportation in 2023 in December, and they then used $1.5 million of state allocated funding specifically for wildlife crossing and planning for our engineering design and planning. And they conducted scoping on the 2 priority sites, and then we all agreed that the Mariposa Preserve at milepost 1.7 was the best site, which was inside the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument with public lands on both sides. And others are going to talk a little bit more about that, particularly Colin, and we're going to talk about that. $1.5 million that came from the state funding was critically important for us moving forward. So in June 2023, ODOT applied for the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program, which was a federal grant that was integral or was established for during the in the infrastructure bill, IIJA funding, and let's see. So we applied for that grant. Again, the appropriated funds for the state match was $7 million. I'm going to let Colin talk more about that. We applied for the grant in June of 2023, and we were notified in December of that year that we did not get the federal grant. In August of 2024, we reapplied for that grant. We did have a debrief from the Federal Highway Administration of why we didn't win it. Senator Merkley's office helped us get that set up, and they told us we were a fantastic, highly recommended for funding application. They just ran out of money. We said, what do we need to change in the application to reapply and get it in the next round? And they said, absolutely nothing, just please reapply. And we were pleasantly surprised with all of that. So in March, let's see, so we reapplied and we were awarded the $33 million in December of 2024 for a total cost of the project for $38 million. This is for one bridge at the Mariposa Preserve. We know what happened. January 2025, the funds were frozen by the Trump administration. We were all a little stressed. But in March of 2025, then ODOT did a value engineering process. Dan is going to talk a lot more about that, which brought the total cost down significantly. Again, just a tremendous process. He's going to talk a little bit more about that. Then in April 2025, just a month ago, we got the announcement from ODOT and the Federal Highway Administration that the WCPP federal grant funding has been released for use. And yeah, this is one of those, you hope for the best and plan for the worst, but we're going. We're moving forward. So ODOT is proceeding with the IGA. Dan's going to talk more about that. The contract negotiations, which is basically the scoping and agreeing. And once that is signed, we're a go. And Dan's going to talk a little bit more about the construction schedule. We were looking at 2027. We are hoping to move that up because all of us continue to be stressed about the funding, and we want to get this thing done. So we're gonna work on that. We did some serious fundraising, as I mentioned. We raised more than $700,000. A big portion of that was a $400,000 congressionally directed spending for the fence design, which came specifically and importantly through Senator Merkley's office. He's on the Congressional Appropriations Committee. And that money, I personally think, was really what helped propel us to win the federal award, because it really showed a high level of support from the congressionals. And we raised $325,000 from coalition members, private donors, and foundations, and I just kind of put some of them up there. Again, the Carpenter Foundation locally, we were not in their wheelhouse. We applied. Jack wrote a great application through OWF, and we got some money on that. Bob and Susie Givens has been fantastic. Again, OWF on their own and helping us to fundraise through the OLEF Foundation. Just some, money just coming into us, which has been fantastic. We also applied to America the Beautiful. We were unsuccessful. BLM, we knocked on their door a couple of times. They did not come through with funding, but they did give us a very supportive letter of support for the federal grant, and that was from the DC level, and that was super helpful. Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund continues to support us. OWEB supported us, and the tribes. Tribes are not part of our coalition because they did not have the capacity to join us and come to meetings, but they have been extremely supportive and also have been involved with ODOT's subcommittees on the landscaping. And I think Dan might talk about, maybe Jack can talk a little bit about more of that, what the landscaping on the bridge and also the artwork on the side of the bridge. Real quickly, this is the ODOT Wildlife Vehicle Crossing Collision Map. Because ODOT had this data that showed that when we originally looked, it's 2016 to 2020 map. This is what we used and then what we submitted to the federal grant. This showed us in a red zone. So that's what we used as documentation for, this is what we want to lower. This is a Federal Highway Administration grant at the federal level. So what they were looking for was a decrease in wildlife vehicle collisions. So we had 159 deer, 5 bear, 1 cougar, and the unknown of animals coming up to the highway and turning around and not trying to cross. This was our original site map. Thank you, Charlie, who put this together. Let me see if I can do this. We did, okay, I'm not going to forget it. Neal Creek, Barron Creek, Wall Creek and the railroad bridge and Mount Ashland exit on this side of the summit. There's a culvert up at the Siskiyou summit, Bear Gulch culvert area, Mariposa Preserve, which was our selected site in the end, and then there's a couple of south culverts and overcrossings down way near the California border. We went out, we looked at all these. ODOT looked at when we got down to Barron Creek and the Mariposa Preserve as our 2 top choices. ODOT went out and looked at them, and they did a bunch of geotechnical holes out of the Mariposa Preserve site of where the bridge would work best, what they could do with it, and that's where we selected. That's what we landed on. Main reasons for why we landed on the Mariposa Preserve site. This is going to be, this will be the first and only wildlife overcrossing on Interstate 5 from Mexico to Canada, to the border to border, which we also thought was a positive for the federal grant. It's Interstate 5. Reasons we all probably know: biodiversity and the number of wildlife, reconnects the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, the public lands that we have been distressed about for so many years. And it was the preferred location for ODOT in terms of sight lines and being able to get the bridge done. Dan can talk about that. It's going to be 200 feet by 700 feet approximately. The bridge landscaping and the artwork is being addressed by subgroups with tribal input, as I mentioned earlier. Fencing, it's going to be 2 miles on each side going into California, which also made us a bi-state project that the feds love. Well, you're cooperating with your neighbors. So that fence is Yeah, right. So the fence is getting us into that. ODOT has been fantastic with this. From my first cold call to Darren Newval, who is the district manager in Region 3, me saying, okay, this is who I am. We had not met. We didn't know each other. This is Amy Amrine. We're working on a wildlife crossing. What do you think? Could ODOT join us? Is this something you would be interested in? And his first response was, yes, tell me more about it. And ODOT has been absolutely fantastic from that moment forward. Dan, what's his last name? Thank you, Dan Roberts. Okay, so Dan's first name is Thomas, so it's Thomas Dan Roberts, and and it's always Dan Thomas, and I know that's wrong. Okay, Dan is our project manager with ODOT. He has been our champion inside ODOT and has done more fights and more negotiation and more advocacy for our project than anybody else, and he's going to give a presentation today. He's the guy, and we really can't say enough and thank him enough for everything that he has done and what he's going to do. We're still on this. I think that's all I have. Again, the project, I think Steve mentioned, we're probably the fastest project of this sort from conception and dreaming to making it happen. When we met, we knew that the infrastructure bill that President Biden was going to actually get it done after all the talk in the past, but he was going to get it done, and that there was going to be new money coming into Oregon for wildlife crossings, or at least new money that we might be able to tap into. We have been incredibly fortunate with the state funding that Colin and Mara is going to talk about later. Without that money, we would not be able to be where we are. Our private fundraising has been phenomenal. The support of everybody has been, nobody has said no to us. And so we are now moving towards construction in 5 or 6 years, which the one down in California, the Wallace Annenberg, took 15 years, 10 to 15 years from concept to getting funding. So we had our eye on the prize of the infrastructure money coming down. We wanted to be shovel ready because we knew in the past with stimulus money, you have to be shovel ready, so our planning began. So I'm going to turn it over down to Jack, and we're going to hold questions until the end. So thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I get to be round 2 of this, four-person presentation. And yeah, thanks. That was a great intro, I think, and description of the coalition and what we've been able to accomplish. You know, it I guess has been a fast project, but I tell you, when you get retirement age and so forth, 3 or 4 years seems like it isn't always that fast. But and I want to talk about a slightly different project from our coalition. Amy talked about the Mount Ashland, the Mariposa overcrossing, wildlife overcrossing, a really big project, and we're going to continue that discussion with Karen and Dan. But I also want to talk about a smaller project that we've envisioned and hope to be working on very shortly, the Mount Ashland Exit project. Now, this isn't a $30 million project. It's not a $3 million. It's not a $1 million. It's about what is it? About a $360,000 project, I believe, was the final amount on that, and that includes a fairly significant amount, about $50,000 or so, from towards SOU in terms of monitoring, and that's a significant part of this that I'll talk about. But so this is kind of another kind of multi-organized effort among the crew. Amy showed this map, and again, I think everybody probably knows where Mount Ashland Exit is. We're about 4 miles north of the Mariposa overcrossing site, which is about milepost 1.7, and the Mount Ashland Exit, I think, is officially milepost 6, but it's in that area. The fencing won't extend that far north, obviously, from the Mariposa site. But what we realized when we started looking at this, and this is again back to acknowledging Charlie Shells when he was with BLM and helping us find these sites, looking at areas that had existing culverts, areas that had existing bridges, areas that had places where wildlife either wanted to cross or were occasionally crossing, maybe without much assistance from us. This is obviously, we all know, very busy highway, about 17,000 vehicles per day. A lot of wildlife are just deflected from trying to cross, but some try to cross, some don't make it. Some try to cross and some do make it. And the Mount Ashland exit is a site, an existing bridge site where animals do cross. And we began looking at this as a possibility of trying to improve wildlife crossing at this site. So here's a little bit of a aerial view, Google Earth view of the Mount Ashland exit. So exit 6 on I-5, it's a busy place. It looks like a busy place from a road standpoint. And yet animals do cross underneath the interstate under the existing bridges. We've seen a lot of deer moving through this area. And so we began to wonder, well, are there things that we could actually do to improve the potential of wildlife to move, to utilize this existing site, make it a little bit more wildlife friendly? This, I should point out the buildings right over here, this is an ODOT maintenance facility, and we actually got some interesting information from the ODOT staff about what wildlife are doing. The arrows are pointing to the bridge structures. It's a complex interchange, of course, but it's a relatively lightly used interchange, right? There isn't a whole lot of traffic that's coming down towards Callahan's in that area. Some obviously traffic going to the Mount Ashland ski area, but other than I-5 itself, it's not that heavily traveled. So it provides some opportunities. Okay, here are the bridges, the exit bridges. The interstate obviously traveling above there. You'll see a few deer there. This is the south, what we call the south embankment area underneath the two bridges. And we found that animals did utilize these areas. These animals don't look particularly stressed. They're just munching and moving along. It doesn't look like great habitat, particularly for the animals to get back and forth, but we did notice and we did pick up and have documented quite a bit of deer use underneath these bridges, utilizing those on both this south embankment as well as the flip side on the north embankment. Just sort of game trail type use. Well, so what might we be able to do to improve the wildlife, safe wildlife passage? And we came up with this idea of sort of creating a wildlife bench along that same south embankment I was just showing you. So running underneath the bridges, about maybe 600 or 700 feet long, maybe about 8 feet wide, this wildlife bench. And we would have trees, boulders, shrubs that would help maybe shield the bench area, the travel way, the wildlife travel way from the highway. So that's the concept that we're working on here, realizing as well that we could duplicate this if we were successful. We could duplicate it on the other side of the road as well on the north embankment. Well, so what are the objectives here? Well, we want to increase the frequency of wildlife use and species diversity. So far, we've just really seen deer mostly utilizing this area, but we know that there's a lot of other species out there. And we want to learn what the best wildlife-friendly design might be. So one of the interesting components of this project is a strong monitoring courtesy of Karen and Sean and others at SOU. And I think, in fact, you have about 27 months worth of monitoring proposed for this. So we want to do a strong year of monitoring before any construction is done at all, a little bit of monitoring through construction, and then a little over a year's worth of monitoring post-construction to see if our improvements make any sense to the wildlife and if they're using them or not. And then that will determine whether we make modifications to this south site and or whether we build something on the north end, on the opposite end of the road. So the monitoring component is very important on this, really critical. And that's, as other people have said, that's the one that frankly is the hard one to always find the funding for. And I'm sure Karen can talk a lot more about that than she would probably want to. So here's a rendition of, again, that sort of a ODOT concept drawing showing you this wildlife bench area, again about 8 feet wide. It would partially be planted, providing a little bit of a shield between the highway and the wildlife, and again possibly doing a similar kind of thing on the other side, depending on what we find. The schedule for all of this, we've done 2 applications to the Oregon Conservation Recreation Fund, one really for the construction and another for the monitoring effort. We've also had some conversations with OWEB about funding the monitoring, as well as some private funders. So we're really working on trying to get that monitoring going as well. This is a project that could potentially take place relatively soon, with monitoring starting later this year. The construction would probably be done by the ODOT teams themselves rather than contracting out, and then post-construction monitoring, and then figuring out what we should do relative to improvements on the other side. So this is a bit of a different project for us. It's sort of at the other end of the scale, and our envision when we pulled the coalition together in the first place was to have some sort of a network of wildlife crossings from the city of Ashland to the California border. And this is an area that we identified fairly early as one that we knew wildlife were getting across, but perhaps we can improve it. But also realizing that, the wildlife kind of know what they're doing, and they'll help tell us what the best plan is. So it's a little bit of a more modest approach to what we have. So that's the Mount Ashland Exit Project. And I'll have the pleasure to bring on Karen Mager.
Up there with slideshow. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Mager, Associate Professor here at SOU, and I'm going to be presenting on our monitoring work along with Sean Johnson, a recent SOU grad from our bachelor's program, who's now our research assistant and really deserves the lion's share of the credit for everything that's gotten done in the last 2 years. All right. So we're going to be talking about some of the monitoring work that we've been doing, and I'm going to focus today's talk on our pre-construction monitoring for the Mariposa Overpass specifically. But really, this has been a fantastic opportunity to get all kinds of cool observations. How often do you see 2 mountain lions hanging out together? And so I'm really excited to show you some of the really interesting observations that we've seen today. Okay, so our big question with this monitoring is just how do some of the larger bodied terrestrial wildlife use the I-5 corridor and its existing infrastructure right now? Because while this highway was certainly not built to accommodate wildlife passage, there are creative strategies animals are using to try to cross the road, some more successful than others. So we really wanted to understand that. And this current landscape really involves a lot of tragedy. So one of our first field trips ever as a coalition, we found this dead bear along the side of the road. And wildlife experience, let me see if this is gonna work. Nope. Can you click the video for me? Wildlife experience discomfort trying to cross the road. So this is at the one railroad bridge that does go across the highway. And These deer are using the railroad bridge to cross the highway, but you can see they're apprehensive. There's a lot of noise, there's not a lot of habitat, it's very narrow. And so a big part of our work has just been to kind of inform the planning and design of wildlife crossing structures and improvements by seeing what some of our problem areas are right now. And also, kind of as Jack talked about, seeing where the animals are already trying to go and let them show us what they need. And the goal, of course, is to get to this. This is one of ODOT's conceptual rendering from like a deer's eye view of what it will look like to cross that overpass, right? Big, broad, lots of view, habitat, sound dampening. And so the work that we're doing really lays the groundwork for baseline data to monitor the effectiveness of this overpass in the future. So our approach has started really exploratory. It really started by this guy. Charlie Shells was the first to put cameras out, and then I kind of jumped on the bandwagon. And it was really exploratory, putting cameras out at different places on the landscape that we thought might be interesting from an animal's perspective. Culverts, bridges, underpasses. And then it's become more targeted over time with the Mariposa overpass design to include the actual location of that overpass and think about where will these future fence lines go? Where are the jump outs going to be that wildlife will use to come from the highway back onto the safe side? How might animals use culverts? And so we're shifting to a more targeted monitoring approach focused on that overpass that includes both areas that are going to be impacted by these improvements, but also control areas that we don't expect to be impacted, so we can do that comparison. And we use camera traps, game cameras, really great tool to get videos and images, really great way to engage students in lots of field work, so there's a huge educational component to this program. I try to bring at least 50 different students out to our field sites every year, and we've had 18 either paid student researchers or full-year capstone projects on this in the last few years. And then, of course, what we get out of it is images. Cool ones like a mama bobcat with 3 kittens walking under the interstate in a culvert. And so these images give us not only species, group composition, but also information like date, time of day, temperature, the context in which they're moving. That's the fun part of the work. And then the other 80% of it is done on the computer. So we take our SD cards. We've collected over 1.4 million image files so far since 2021. We feed them through some wildlife AI. And Sean, if you can click this one. We use Mega Detector, a program that will detect and draw a box around wildlife. So this is actually 2 elk in the Mariposa Preserve, pretty close to where this wildlife overpass will be built. And once we draw the boxes around the animals, we can feed that into this image classification system where we identify species and condense them. And out of those 1.4 million images, we've detected 15,000 animals, just to give you a sense of what this process looks like. So, oh, that time the video did work. There we go. I'm going to turn it over to Sean now to talk a little bit about what we found.
Okay, so our study area is this 10-mile stretch of I-5 between Ashland, Oregon, and the California border. For reference, the red star in the inset map is where we are like right now at SOU. Currently, we have 28 cameras, and they are represented by the blue dots on the map. So let's talk about what species we are seeing in our study area. So this graph is a way to represent like what wildlife species we see and how frequently we see them. On our y-axis is the camera locations from north to south, and on our x-axis is our capture rate. And the capture rate is one way to measure how frequently we see species. So each camera bar has smaller, different colored sections. Each of these sections is a specific species, and the width of that section indicates how frequently we observe them. So for instance, the gray sections at the end of almost every of these camera bars are deer. So you can get a sense that we see deer like a lot, and we see them almost everywhere. So this red line is the Siskiyou Pass, with all the cameras north of the pass above the line and all the cameras south of the pass below the line. So just at a glance, you can see that the cameras to the south have higher biodiversity just based on the increased number of these colored sections. So here's our crossing site. These are our 4 crossing site cameras, and were put up in the fall of 2023 by Karen Mauger and Charlie Shells. And this is our current observed species list. The picture on the bottom right there was taken standing on the east side where SOU 10 is, and sort of looking west to the other side. So there's a few animals we still haven't seen yet. We haven't got a couple of our medium-bodied raccoons, for instance, we haven't seen, and we also haven't seen more of our rare species like fisher. But we've almost observed all of the large-bodied species. The only one we have not seen yet is elk up here. And it was just last month, actually, that we got our first observed cougar on both sides of the crossing site. On the left is on the west side of I-5, and on the right is the east side, and these were actually taken 6 days apart. So like as we just saw with the cougars, sometimes it takes quite a while to capture all the species in an area. And this graph shows how much effort is needed to observe all present species. And in this case, like effort is what we call trap nights. And a trap night is a 24-hour period that the camera is active. And that is on our x-axis. And then species richness is on our y-axis. The green dots are our camera locations. So some of these cameras only have a month or so of trap nights, more on the left side. And then some of the cameras have been out there for several years and have many trap nights and have captured a lot more species richness, more on the right side. So basically, this graph highlights the amount of time required in order to observe all the species, including our more rare species. We have 2 rare species in our study area that are on the Oregon Conservation Strategy's list of concerned species. The first is the ringtail. The purple circles on the map are the camera locations where we have observed ringtails, and the red star is Siskiyou Pass, just to give an idea of like what side of the mountain range we observe these species. So out of 11,000 unique observations, as Karen said, we only have 13 ringtails. And most of them are in the area between the railroad bridge and the Mount Ashland exit. These right here. There we go. Our second species of concern is the Pacific fisher, represented by the orange dots. And right now we only have 7 observations. 3 of them are in the very northern location, which is Barron Creek. And the other 4 are split between the Bear Gulch and Mariposa Preserve locations. So just kind of to reiterate, it takes a lot of trap nights in monitoring in order to get these rare species of concern documented.
In any observed highway crossing behaviors we might see. So as we noted earlier, there's only one bridge that currently goes over the highway, the railroad bridge. We've seen deer there. We've seen black bears, including this mama and cub. And we've also seen bobcats, cougars, and gray fox. And those are observations where we've seen them clearly crossing the bridge. Obviously, we see a lot more species on this bridge. We're also monitoring several culverts, and this is a gray fox crossing through a culvert at the Mariposa Preserve. We've also seen bobcats. This is the culvert at Bear Gulch, which is a pretty large culvert. It's the only one that's really large. So we got our first bear this year. We got a bear crossing the highway through the Bear Gulch culvert, which is pretty incredible. There it is coming out the other side, so picking it up on 2 different cameras. We've seen a lot of striped skunks at one of ours, and then this is just a reminder, these culverts are not designed for wildlife, right? So there's a bobcat trying to use this culvert, kind of hopping from side to side as it's under really big flows. So those culverts are an important area for us to track too. And just zooming in on this a little bit more, because it's interesting, we definitely see some species really habitually using these culverts. So this is just a quick graph bobcat use of I-5 culverts, and you can see that these blue bars, the capture rates of bobcats actually inside culverts is higher than in the adjacent habitats. So they're definitely selecting and using these culverts really frequently. Same at one location in the southwest arm of Bear Gulch, we've got habitual use of this culvert by a striped skunk that just comes back over and over again. You can see the capture rate scale bar there has to be bigger to capture all of their activity. And then we have some species doing more incidental use, right? So we did see that black bear in the culvert, but it's using the culvert less frequently than adjacent habitats. And the same with gray fox. We've seen them at just one culvert, but using it less often than adjacent habitats. So the fence line eventually will intersect these culverts, and we're going to continue tracking them because wildlife moving along the fence line towards the Mariposa overpass may choose to use culverts instead in some cases, and that'll be interesting. Okay, so let's just finish up here by talking about some of our monitoring plans for the future. The Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program has a primary goal of reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and making highways safer for motorists, but it has a lot of secondary goals, and among those are to really monitor the effectiveness of these structures and to develop a set of best practices for highway wildlife crossings. And so I think our project can make a really unique contribution to that because we're in a biodiversity hotspot. We're not just putting collars on prime antelope and watching them cross highways, as important as it is. We're really interested in the whole suite of wildlife using this area. So we want to continue monitoring in the future to look at whether we see increased diversity of species at that overpass, whether we can observe shifts in road crossing behaviors, obviously reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. This is something ODOT already tracks and will continue to track. We definitely want to try to see highway crossings in the future by fisher and ringtail. It's a stated goal of the Oregon Conservation Strategy. And this is also really important for genetic exchange, right? So thinking about whether we're going to increase gene flow across the highway for not only large mammals, but some of our small mammals and invertebrates. And I want to highlight just how lucky I feel as a researcher to have gotten in on the ground on this project, because pre-construction monitoring of wildlife overpasses is pretty unusual, and pre- and post-construction monitoring is incredibly rare. And so we have a really unique opportunity here to contribute to the scientific community. So just to show you a little bit what that will look like, monitoring started in 2021. We expect the overpass might be built in 2027, and we want to monitor for at least 5 years afterwards. And we can think of the impacted sites as not only that overpass, but these fence lines here along the highway that are going to funnel highway towards the overpass. So we're going to have both control areas and impacted areas. So this is a classic Backy design, before-after control impact, where you can look at what is the magnitude of change experienced in the control area compared to the impact area, with our prediction being that we're going to see a greater magnitude of change in species use of this area, the diversity of species here, shifts in the community structure detected, and wildlife vehicle collisions in that impact area. But in addition to this kind of setup, of course, we just have the opportunity to watch what happens when we build a bridge on the landscape, right? So we're going to be able to watch who's using the overpass, who's using those fence jump outs, who's using the culverts. And I've got all kinds of other dreams and plans if we get the monitoring funding, that being the key thing. Small mammal live trapping every year on the bridge would be a really good opportunity to understand how small mammals move across the highway. We have the potential to do some DNA sampling. And invertebrate surveys, right? Because this bridge may actually be really important for pollinators with the plant communities that are there. So I'll just finish it up by a quick thank you for all the people who've contributed to this. I want to especially shout out Charlie Shells and my colleague, Dr. Bernie Bosco at SOU, who's really helped us with the AI part of this, as well as the people who funded our work so far. And I will hand it over.
So I'm Dan Roberts. You can call me Tom, Dan, or Rob. Any of them will work. I get that all the time, no problem. So With that, I am the project manager. I feel fortunate, like Karen, that I just happened to cross paths with this project and look forward to making the most out of it. So as Amy mentioned, she was a cold call to ODOT and talked about a wildlife crossing, and I got the pleasure of being selected to handle that project. And at first, I got to admit, I was thinking like a typical roadway bridge guy. It's like box beam girders going across I-5 for deer. Okay, this will be interesting. So what I got was a great education. And my hat's off to Jack and Amy and Karen, the coalition. They brought a wealth of information to us because I have to admit, wildlife crossings were not in ODOT's wheelhouse at the time. So we took all this information they presented, looked at it and said, what could we do? So we started looking at some other projects and really working with the coalition and saying, well, how are the wildlife going to use this? What's important? What's not? So in that, let's see. Oops, that was the wrong button. Right button. There we go. So part of what drives ODOT is data and information. So the coalition was great. They worked with their own engineering firms, did their research. Oh, okay. Did their own research and brought the information to us and helped select the 8 locations that they've talked about. And you've seen these. So we took each one of these locations. We did some desk scoping of that to see where could we actually build something. So Dave, we tried real hard on the undercrossings and the tunnels, but just wasn't going to work. So they were considered. So where we did land was at the Mariposa Preserve, and it just so happens that one of the top-rated locations in all their data was also the most feasible for us to construct something. So it's a nice win that we both landed at the same place for the same reason. So, and this is just some of the metrics that they went through to use, and you could see that the new overcrossing was the winner. So what that did is, we'll take that world's fastest wildlife crossing because usually in the world of ODOT, we talk about projects for 2 or 3 years, then we talk about getting funding for 2 or 3 years, and then we do some scoping and some development, and it takes a long time. So the coalition came to us, got introduced to the project. We did our desk scoping, went through the feasibility report, and the nice thing here is we had state funding for design. Usually we have to wait till we get the federal funds in hand to be able to start the design process. And the foresight of working with the state to get these obligated funds was able to get us going on the design effort. So that was part of the 1.5 million. And talk about fast track is we got on site in March of 23. We checked 8 locations, 116 days total, did our site visits, planning, advanced investigations, right-of-way, alternatives analysis, proof of concept, and got us to a DAP level, which usually that's about 70% of our design. So saying a fast track is no kidding. So with that, we also worked with the application team to put the application together that would justify the funding and just what all it was going to do. Great collaborative effort. Rachel Witt, somebody you'll see later this afternoon, was a very integral part of that. And so we applied in 23, as Amy said, and we were quite disappointed that we didn't get the funding, but quite encouraged that they did say, hey, come back and see us next year. We'd really like to have another shot at this. So we did. We submitted it in 24, and we're successful. So a little bit of the locations that we looked at. This was Barron Creek, which was number 2. We originally thought we'd do 2 locations. Initial numbers back of the napkin estimates came in about 10 million each. We thought we could get 20 million. We said, great, let's go for 2. So we looked at Barron Creek, and it's a natural location that we could do an overcrossing. So we scoped that, and we also went to Bear Gulch, where you saw the bear come through the culvert. Down there to the right over here is the actual culvert. So we looked at that, and you can see that's pretty challenging terrain to try to get a structure across there somehow. But we did. We looked it over and really had the team look at what we could do. And this is Mariposa Preserve here. You can see we're standing on the side of the cuts talking about, well, this might be a possibility. And like I said, our bridge guys, our roadway guys lined up and said, hey, I would think this is probably our top location. And so with that, it was good enough in the location that we chose that we went ahead and started to do our subsurface exploration. A lot of expansive clays on the surface and made some of our structural guys a little nervous about the foundations and what it would cost to actually get that done. So we did the drilling. That was after the 23 non-award, and we came back in 24 and reapplied and got that. So part of it was also is getting the funding. Is we came in at a $38 million project, and with ODOT, anything over 25 million, we have to do a VE study. That's a value engineering study, and that's where everybody kind of regroups, looks at the project and says, what could we do better, and what we could do more efficiently. Being this was our first one, it's not surprising we found a few things we could do better. So that'll focus the rest of this on the VE study. So this is the location. And originally, we were talking about a crossing right here going peak to peak. And that was going to be problematic. The MSE walls on the side were going to be really tall, really expensive, really complicated. So we moved the project to the north just a little bit, and we found a good point where we could intersect the grade at both sides. And you can see the roads around there. That's where we did our exploratory drilling to confirm that we actually had rock not too far down, so for our foundations, which we got good results back, so that was a win. So here's just some of our exploratory drilling to confirm what was under the surface. And this is a view, I think Sean had some pictures looking across, and on our drill roads, it gives you an idea of what the wildlife would look like. And we were trying to give them just a nice straight shot so that they didn't even know I-5 was down there. So again, this is up from the old highway perspective and our pre-drilling. So we came up with a concept, and this concept in this location was we had a restriction. The MSE walls needed to be less than 50 feet tall to make things work. So we just kind of followed the contour, and that's what our baseline was to come up with an estimate. So that takes us to the VE study itself. So we came up with 6 key items that we wanted to review for the team. And what we did is we put together another team within ODOT and brought in some other experts that would really help us evaluate what we had as a concept and what we might be able to do better. So get into these things. Let's see, go back. Yeah, one of the big issues was you look at that in the MSE walls, that's a lot of dirt that's got to go into that box to make a surface. So it's 115,000 cubic yards of material that we were going to have to bring in. And when you build MSE walls, the quality of that material is very, it has to be very high quality in order to make the walls work correctly. So that was going to be a challenge. It was going to be expensive. So we said, is there anything else we could do? The structure. The estimate we had August of 24 with the application, the concrete arches that were going to be used to make the tunnels, they went up in $5 million, went up $5 million in cost from August of 24 to April of 25. So that was one of the things we did. We baselined our estimate from a few months before, found some big surprises. So now we're looking at a $43 million project. So good thing we're doing a VE study. And with that, we looked at other kinds of structures, a steel type structure, the MSE walls. Could we do something with that and not have to build those? So, and we also took the VE study to take the first pass at where we would put our fencing to go along with the structure. And so that was a big win that came out of that. And we had our construction sequencing and staging. And we were looking at, with the concrete arches, we were going to have to do a crossover that would be in place for a whole summer. And you would have a lot of expense involved in building that crossover, traffic safety issues, things like that. So could we do something on that front? And with that is the first thing we did was we took on the material issue. And with that, I got a great question up front from the VE team and said, well, do we have to bring material in? Can we just use the material that's on site? I said, I don't know. Let's talk about that. So bottom line is we got rid of the high quality material that was going to fill between the MSE walls to create the surface. And we're going to be able to use material that's all within the ODOT right-of-way and move it about 800 feet with bulldozers instead of trucking in 11,500 dump truck loads. So as you can imagine, that took $4.3 million out of the project right there, just on that one idea. So gives you an idea. You can see the embankment here along where the cuts are, and they've got a natural bench the way they left them, and learned in the process that that's the old way, the 1950s way of doing things, and that from a safety perspective, they would really like to have those just a single plane come down in the cut. So it turns out the blue area that we have there is that will all be material we'll scavenge from the existing roadway, take it down, and we'll create the covering for the crossing. So it saves a few $1 million just there. The other one, talked about the concrete arches. We kept getting sticker shock. The cost of the arches is actually what took us from 2 projects down to 1, is we were looking at that, and we thought $10 million for each. And we got a little further into it, and my structure guy came back and said, hey, you know what? Just the concrete arches is going to make $20 million challenging for 1 location. And I said, oh. So we regrouped, said, well, we'll drop Barron Creek, focus on Mariposa. And what came out of the study was we found that there's actually structural steel alternatives that get us several wins in the project, but we'll actually be able to bring these in modular pieces, bolt them together on site, and set them over, and that saved us $17 million. So said, we'll take it. So gives you an idea of what the structure looks like and how things can go together. And this actually was a domino effect and helped us save money in other things as well. So this really eases construction, and what it does is it eliminated the need for about $3 million to build the crossovers that I mentioned. So we don't have to do that. We'll be able to assemble these arches on the side of the road and do a rolling slowdown. So traffic will be impacted for about 20 minutes at a time while they pick up the structure that's been assembled, set it onto the foundations that are built. So we minimize the traffic impact, save money on the crossover, and keep the traveling public going. So there was a couple of other things that came in, and this is where we got into the MSE walls and the idea of not having the walls to hold the structure in place, but just use material and to use slopes to retain the material. So that was another one of those things that got rolled into several here, but the MSE walls were several $1 million a piece. The sound walls that we had going on top of them were going to be another $2 million each. So you could see that was adding up rather quickly. And some of our wildlife experts that came in to be a part of the VE team shared with us that we could actually do the berms in place of the sound walls, and it still creates the environment on the structure that the wildlife see looks like just natural terrain going from one side to the other. So we get the function out of it at a much lower cost. So several of those coming together, steel plate arch and the rolling slowdowns, the soil berms, all that was a $26 million reduction. So that's $43 million minus 26, and we're starting to feel pretty good about this. So this is an image of what it looks like. This was our concept over here with the walls. This is a crossing that's in Banff National Park up in Canada, and it gives you an idea of what that will look like. So instead of the walls, they just have slopes to retain the surface. And these are the type of berm that would be the place of the orange-colored sound wall. So we get the same effect. And this one, I had a question once about the lines. That's actually the tunnel tops on there. Ours, I promise you, will be well covered. So plenty of material. We'll have good plants and trees and everything up there. And that's kind of an overlay of what the modeling looked like that said we could do that. So this is kind of an updated concept from the results of the VE study. So we don't have the big, nice flat landing areas that we had before. And we found from the wildlife experts and some feedback that we were spending a lot of money to do something that might not be as beneficial as we thought. So we modified that in here. We've got the steel arches, and this doesn't show the berms in here, but there would be berms that would keep the wildlife going across, isolated from that. And then there would be fencing that if wildlife decided to climb the berms, is they weren't going to be able to jump down on the road. So we will retain them there. But ideally, we create the habitat and the environment for them to go across the structure, and they won't be able to see or hear or know much of I-5 down below. So gets into the fencing. We weren't sure how we were going to do that. We hadn't even addressed it yet before the VE study. It was it was pretty lucky guess on my part on the fencing cost. I said it'd be about $2 million based on what we had seen other places, not knowing quite what the fence was going to look like yet. But the wildlife experts that came in and helped us, and turns out we were only $230,000 off. So we ended up getting a lot of the design and verification that it's going to be within our budget. So with that, the other part is that originally we were looking at 1.5 miles of fencing on both sides of the structure. And after the VE study and everything else considered, is we're going to have 2.5 miles of fencing on both sides of the structure. So we extended the limits of the fencing much further than we originally had planned, and still kept it in budget. These are some of the jump outs that were mentioned. Right now we're slated to do 12 of those. So any wildlife that finds itself on the highway and needs to get back to safety, is they can go up these ramps, and on the other side is they can jump off and stay back in the wilderness side. So Amy mentioned a two-state project. This is the Hilt exit down in California, and we'll be running the fence down there and be able to work with them. Caltrans has been very excited to work with us. They've got some big plans for wildlife crossings down there. So we're working together, a lot of cooperation and excitement on that front. So the bottom line, we get to the end of the VE study, and this shows the alternatives listed up here, and those range from the steel structure and those things, the traffic control being rolling slowdowns, soil berms, no sound walls, using the embankment on site. We took a $43 million project and cut $27.5 million out of the cost. So we now have a $33 million award in a project that I think will get delivered somewhere between 15 and 20 million. So that was the value and purpose of a value engineering study. So.
Amazing. Start to finish, just amazing. The power of an open mind when people say yes, let's try to do that. Power of the courage to ask for what needs to be done, to use science, to use monitoring. Amazing. And we are going to, we talked about this within the coalition. Eventually, we hope to have a film or a video version of this called How to Make a Wildlife Crossing. Because it's a really, and you know, people have said, well, how did you do that? How did you do that? It's really important because it seems unapproachable. And this was my reaction when Amy came to me for lunch and said, I think we can do this. Like, sure we can. Michael said, oh, we got to keep this on the agenda for the Connectivity Symposium. Sure, Michael, that's great. Sure, keep that big dream in view. Now let's get down to real business. But here we are in record time. And yeah, it's amazing. So questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah, here.
Are there any plans to carry forward the crossing to the north? And sounds like you have any leftover money?
Yeah, the question, so we're repeating questions in part for the audience out there in video land. Are there, is the savings, can the savings go to the crossing to the north, or what's our thought about the crossing to the north?
We tried that, but no, unfortunately. The grant was for the Mariposa location, and the way that's structured is we've got the funding to work with, and when we get done, we really anticipate having millions of dollars left over, but that would go back to the funding program and into their pool for another round of projects. So we could apply for another one and could get that, but no, they wouldn't let me do 2 for 1. So.
Not yet.
I'll add to that Colin and Amara are going to talk about the statewide effort. There is a statewide list of wildlife crossing locations and projects that was used by Representative Helm's office to justify some funding, long-term permanent funding sources, and we ensured that Barron Creek was on that list. So on the statewide list, Barron Creek still exists, plus a little bit of money, $2 million for a Neal Creek upgrade like we're doing at Mount Ashland. So again, looking at the corridor and making it more permeable in many locations.
One good crossing deserves another. Colin.
Just two things. One, just a comment. I had the opportunity to go throughout the state and participate in other projects, but also go to the state house and advocate for crossings funding. Just a comment and then a quick question. I had the opportunity to go across the state to participate in other projects, but also go to the state house and advocate for funding and policy changes. And this project is like supercharged our efforts. The work they've done, referencing this project at the state house, dragging Amy out to talk to other projects in other parts of the state, going down the projects that are in the chute, so to speak. It's been fantastic. I just cannot underscore how important this project is, how motivating it is for other areas of the state to say, hey, look, community came together, and look what they've done. There's no reason why we can't do that here as well. And it's just been fantastic. So thank you so much for doing all that you've done. Quick question, though, for Dan. The lessons learned from the VE study and others, is there a way that we're like, y'all are memorializing those for future projects? Or is it sort of, hey, this is a location-specific type of deal?
No, we are absolutely capturing all of this in a big book of lessons learned. And fortunately, before we went to build it, so going back to the Barron Creek question is, while I can't just start that project up, is everything we have learned on Mariposa translates over to what we would do at Barron Creek. So we could do the same thing at a much reduced price from what we initially thought going into this. This was new to us. There was no baseline. There was no real source of information for us. So we kind of had a, I guess, best way to call it is a Cadillac design up front. And that's where some of the size, the mass, the structure, all those things was a bunch of roadway guys thought, how do we get deer across the road? So we came up with that. And turns out when we got everybody together and more of the wildlife folks really talking and, you know, looking at what was functional, what was nice to have versus what had to have. And we really found a nice balance there that we can make the most functional crossing possible for the least amount of money. And that does open up to, let's take this concept and go elsewhere and do it again. So
in the realm of policy and planning and conservation work, I call that courage building. To realize that these things can be done, to build confidence, to be the risk takers and go out first, figure things out. Yeah.
I've got two questions. Just to confirm, earlier in your talk, you said that on the Mariposa Preserve, which is milepost 1.7, you're looking at fencing for 2 miles on each side of the structure. And then at the end, you mentioned 2.5 miles of fence. Is it 2.5 miles? Because that brings it down into California by 1/10 of a mile.
yeah, actually we're going almost a full mile into California. Yeah, we extended the northern terminus as well. So we found that we had some natural locations to end the fencing. So yeah, it ends up, it's about 2.5 miles in both directions from the structure.
Question for Karen. On your pictures, on your trail camera pictures, you show 2 pictures of elk. Do you ever have them crossing the road or just walking along the road?
We typically pick up elk at the Mariposa Preserve, just less than half a mile south of where the crossing is going to be built. So they're right there in the area. We have picked them up at 1 or 2 other locations, but never at any of the places right next to the road.
You've never seen them cross?
We've never seen them cross, no. But we know that they're very close to where the overpass is going to be built.
There's a herd behind a hilt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what they call the asparagus fields. And then there's also a herd down across from the ag station on the east side.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no crossing. So we don't know whether that's in the freeway or whether it's just migration.
Right, yeah, we don't see the elk show up in the wildlife vehicle collision data so far, which is good because that's expensive and obviously not good for elk either. But I'm really excited and optimistic that we're going to see them crossing on that overpass. The great thing about overpasses, just briefly, you know, I showed all that culvert footage, but ungulates, you know, deer and elk, they like that big open sky, big sight lines. That's where they're most comfortable. And so we think it's going to be really friendly to those most abundant species that are most likely to be in vehicle collisions.
I asked Amy if this was okay to say. We weren't allowed to say the W word for a long time until the funding was really secure. But what do you think, Karen, about the chance that wolf might use the crossing?
I'm like anxiously awaiting the day we pick one up on our cameras. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if wolves move into that area, they could certainly cross the road there. And every time we see a coyote, we like look at it a little closely to make sure. But yeah, so far no signs of wolves. But I think it's pretty close to where OR7 crossed on that big dispersal event.
Okay, I'm going to go back to you mentioning my name on this. When we were first fundraising, I reached out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife up in Roseburg, and they were super excited. They had some money, $30,000 they could give us, but they wanted to say that and advertise and put out that it was for wolves. And I said no, because everybody's on board here. And a wolf issue is going to divide our coalition, not so much our coalition that we have, but our broader public coalition that is supportive of this. So as Steve mentioned, I've always said, thank you for your money. We're not going to discuss it though. And they came through with the funding. So again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife have been super supportive, continue to be super. They came down and did a tour with us. So they have been wonderful, and they are very much looking forward to seeing a wolf cross this.
This question maybe is for Steve and Maya, and I'm guessing maybe I should look at those maps first, but I'm just wondering how this overpass connects with other preserved lands for greater connectivity.
What a wonderful question, how connectivity and conserved lands come together. My colleague Paul Delson is going to talk about that in the afternoon session, but yes, this is very much in a corridor of existing conserved lands. Our organization has recently acquired our first fee-owned preserve on the Klamath side of the divide that feeds into, yes, Bear Gulch, where the bears cross under the highway, and we're hoping with Karen to extend the monitoring out to that zone about not quite a mile on a line of sight and a gulch of transmission for wildlife on the west side of what will be the crossing in, what, like 5 minutes from now? So yeah, no, and it's very much a part of our strategy, as Paul's going to talk about later, about how do you integrate connectivity and the choices of which lands to conserve next, and how do we go from the historic kind of piecemeal approach to saying, well, we'll take lands that are available for conservation to being very proactive and deliberate and intentional in saying, how can we take the lands that are conserved now and extend them into corridors by having adjacent lands as much as possible, build up to what we're trying to call the on-ramp for connectivity and wildlife crossing. The bridge, the crossing is great, but the animals have to have safe places. Again, it's safety for people and safety for animals, which is, again, the combined interest. One of the reasons this project was so successful is that we can beat the drum of public safety, we can beat the drum of wildlife safety, we can beat the drum of all the things that we want for the actual functioning ecology of our region all at the same time. So we find these common interests, common values, overlapping positives between people and wildlife and ecology. This is where we can score. So thank you, that's a great question.
Just also, if I could add to that, all the sites that we've looked at, the sort of wild connection area has been very critical. PFT, Pacific Forest Trust, has some lands there, or management agreements to some lands just on the west side of the Mount Ashland exit. Also Barron Creek site. Southern Oregon Land Conservancy is very involved in kind of connections through that Bear Gulch and Colstein Valley. We've got the Forest Service lands up to the west, and of course we're in the middle of some BLM land. So, that's been a critical question, I think, on all of these sites that we've looked at is what are the wild land connection opportunities?
So one of the best books I've read recently is called Crossings, and it's about road ecology. And if any of you have not read it, I'm going to give you a copy because it's outstanding. So as a wildlife biologist myself, I'm really interested in the section that talked about specific habitat elements and how to design these wildlife crossings based on existing ones in Banff and other areas to solicit use by various species. So it might be like, coarse woody debris for salamanders and frogs and such, and then cavities for woodpeckers, for instance. And so just wondering, I saw that the design looks like it's fairly open, kind of shrubby. Just wondering if who the wildlife biologists are that are involved to help design the actual features of the wildlife crossings.
Yeah, ODOT engaged a group of biologists and sort of landscape architects. So they've got a habitat and landscape subgroup that has been very involved in sort of seed mix discussions and planning discussions. And that's part of the idea of having that kind of 200-foot width that we could have both open areas, we could have boulders and large wood, we could have just a variety of kind of habitats, because we know we're trying to attract a variety of species, and we'll just have to see how that works out. But that's certainly in our minds, and I know is in ODOT's mind as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand upon that a little bit. Is the planting that we're planning on doing, very much like the Klamath Dam restoration, is everything we intend to plant is native and connected to the monument and to the wildlife. And something that I've learned in this process, and I hope we achieve here, there was a symposium that I went to in Colorado a couple of years ago, and we went on site to a couple of their crossings. And one of the things that was unique was it was driven largely by a massive elk herd that was always crossing the road. But what came out of it, like a year after they built this, it was an undercrossing in this case, and they had some water too, is they had a windrow of brush that went through the whole structure as well. And they called it their frog cam. So they had a little camera down there just to see what was going through. They knew they had a couple of species that might be in there. And a year later, they found 17 new species that had gone through that windrow, and they caught on camera. So they had a big surprise. Part of this here, again, my education, started out, made sense, get the deer, the elk, the bear over. All of our planting is geared all the way down to the pollinators, the Franklin bumblebee, and some of the, I can't think of all of them off the top, but our tribal partners have made it extremely important to us to capture all the, cultural connections they have. And I'm probably going to say this wrong, but I think it's a dragonfly. There's one, you might correct me, but to learn the cultural importance to them and the fact that we are building habitat and pollinator, habitat for them to be a part of it so that they are induced to use the crossing as well. So we're going from the very large animals down to, insect level. Everybody is going to try to be accommodated here, and that is addressed in our planting. So.
I like to think of it, the idea there that when you do get to the point of pollinators, dragonflies, migratory birds, we're really, it's great to have California on board, but we're really talking about species that are in the flyway all the way from Central America to points much further north. So this is, again, in terms of connectivity, habitat value, the impact of the work that we're doing, even though we're talking about local wildlife, it's migratory health over a much, much broader range. And so we're just contributing to the whole big picture, north, south, east, west, because we have the opportunity to do it here. Any more questions? Up in the back. Hang on. This is a long run to the mic. He's moving left. He's changing.
I was talking with a landowner recently in that area, and they were aware of the wildlife crossing, and we got a question. They said, well, is that going to enable more people to come into our area? And that threw me. And I don't know.
Yeah, actually, that is a big part of our consideration in that, because we do have the Pacific Crest Trail in the area, and there's a lot of hunting activity in the area. But yeah, we don't have any surefire way to say we'll prevent it, but it's going to be highly discouraged. And I actually have our sign guys working on some special signs just for those folks that might want to use it. So yeah, we're going to do everything we can to impede pedestrians from wanting to go up and use the bridge. In fact, we're going to be, it's kind of secondary to the project, but there's a spot up on the old highway. I think we're going to stop there tomorrow and do the overlook. Okay. That you'll see on the trip, but there's a natural place up there that has a great view of where the crossing is going to be. So It's kind of secondary to this project. My next one is to get us built a kiosk up there, kind of a viewing area that we could direct people up there to see the crossing and maybe even get to see the wildlife using it. But it's far enough away that nobody's going to be tempted to try to go down and get on the crossing. That's our hope anyway.
Back to bugs. I'm just sitting here thinking about it. I love, the pollinators and the thought behind it. Is there any concerns about attracting things that fly, more insects that maybe are of sensitive conservation to that area, more birds who would hunt those insects to an area that does go over a pretty heavily trafficked area?
Yeah, our goal in that is to have all the plantings that will be done on there have a specific intent and purpose for being there. We're not just planting certain plants just for ornamental value or because it would look nice with trees on there. Our plant landscape habitat group has gone through and identified all these. So part of the process, and you can jump in, Jack, if you need, but selecting plants that would attract those insects, those pollinators, but would also give them habitat and cover in their natural habitat. So there could be birds that might prey on them, but part of the goal is to build an ecosystem on the structure that would allow them to pass through there to exist without being totally exposed. So
I think you got it. That's a consideration even with a deer or elk in terms of would predators hang out at the ends of the overcrossing? Do they currently hang out at the ends of some of the larger culverts? And part of that is why you monitor these things and you study them, because there's a lot in this field that we just don't know.
Will the plantings extend along the fencing to help attract animals towards the bridge to kind of help them with the directionality of specific spots?
Yes, and in fact, that's actually was the purpose. I think Amy mentioned that we've approached BLM a couple of times, and the idea there was to try to improve some of the habitat and kind of the approach areas on both sides, because as everybody knows, we get a lot of invasive species, plant species that tend to get along highways and disturbed areas and so forth. So yeah, I think there's certainly some opportunities there. I don't think the funding that we have in hand could go much beyond the right of way, but I know that's been something that we've talked about. Yeah, those approach lands and opportunities for habitat improvements, and we'll still be talking to BLM about that.
That brings up one of my small gripes, is that these funding sources, because they're talking about the transportation corridor, do not have accompanying funding for building the on-ramp off the transportation corridor yet. So it's something we have to figure out. The other thing is that, correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, one of the things that I think is fascinating that I've heard in the research about these crossings is that there's a process of generational learning for the wildlife. That they actually, once the first generation finds these crossings, they will help teach their offspring, and it becomes a learned habit.
Yeah, there can be, and that's one reason we want to make sure we're monitoring far enough out. I mean, frankly, 5 years is still pretty short afterwards, with the plant communities still developing and the construction footprint. But I did just recently talk with, there's some researchers up at OSU Cascades in Bend who've been studying the Highway 97 underpasses that were put in, and I just was in touch with them last week, and they said actually the animals showed up right away, at least some of them. The elk and deer showed up pretty quickly to start using those crossing structures. They still recommended at least 5 years of monitoring, but they were pleasantly surprised. So, and we saw that with the Klamath too, right? There are fish in the river. So we'll have to wait and see, but yeah, it'll be something we'll learn.
Yeah, I think those lunches laid out, so we're gonna do one more question. Sorry.
It's gonna be two, but it's gonna be quick. One is, are hunting regulations gonna come along with, this is a new thing. Hunters could use this to their advantage because you're funneling wildlife into an area. So is that part of the plan, is to how do we get our regulations to keep people away from those, to take advantage of that? And the other part is on your vegetation, with all the, what we call climate change, in the climate that we have around here, are you thinking about that in the amount of vegetation you're gonna put in this crossing? Because you could enable a fire to get across the freeway if you don't consider that.
I'll take the hunters issue. A part of our coalition is the Oregon Hunters Association and the backcountry hunters and anglers. And I will tell you that the Oregon Hunters Association local guy has been fantastic with this. And we've talked, and he is more concerned, as concerned as we are, with hunters hanging out at the ends of the fences. And he, last time I spoke to him and the legislature is in session, he was going to just kind of quietly get maybe perhaps some legislation that would make it illegal for hunters to be within some distance of a wildlife crossing and the ends of the fences of a wildlife crossing. So that is in the works. Whether it happens or not, we'll see, but it is as much their concern. You know, there's always bad eggs, and those are the ones that to be concerned about. But he was beginning to think about that and work on it. I was impressed that he called me and said, "This is what I'm going to do." I said, "Okay, great."
Going back again to the importance of policy and public education as an element of all this. Well, let's thank our presenters. This has been a tremendous morning. More to come. Have lunch. We will come back. Continue. Thank you all for your good questions. Let's have a little snack, and we'll see you at what time?
Yeah.
1:30.
Thank you.
We'll start again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for all your help.
Yeah. It's exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did we cover enough?
I think so.
I kept thinking, oh, I didn't say this. I didn't say that.
That was a big, a lot of information. A lot of learning.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.